hominem is a fallacious argument style that asserts that a person's argument is incorrect because that person has some sort of bad or unwelcome quality. Erica thinks that gibbons are the best ape, but Erica is also annoying and I really don't like her voice. Therefore, Erica's argument as to why gibbons are the best ape is wrong by association with her, the person. For example, it's fallacious because someone can be a jerk or really get under your skin and still be right. This means that ad hominems are a really lazy means by which to win someone over to your point. The best way to argue is with data and sound reasoning, preferably both. But what do you do when someone is factually, demonstrably, wholesale wrong all the time, and they also happen to be a jerk? Enter the YouTube channel, Standing for Truth.
See how the surf want to grow. And they give it all they've got. And they give it all they've got. And you give it all you've got. See how the brain gets around. You fall inside a hole you couldn't see. You fall inside a hole inside of someone. Help me understand what's going on inside my mind. Doctor, I can't tell if I'm not me.
Where do we even begin with Donnie? That's right, longtime Gutsick Gibbon viewers and enjoyers, we're busting out the real names today. This channel, along with its sister channel, Young Earth Creation, is run by a dynamic duo composed of two 30-something-year-old men, Donnie and Raw Matthew, and claims a continued interest in, quote, doing discussions and promoting truth. Topics of coverage are biblical creation, refuting evolution, eternal security, sharing the gospel, Young Earth Creation, we already did that one, science, interviews, debates, and discussions. Donnie, or Mr. Standing for Truth himself, is a former used car salesman with maybe some experience in nursing, we're not really sure. He also used to work at McDonald's, and Raw Matt is like a random guy who used to be a breatharian and promotes some pretty bizarre ideas about living to be like 900 or something. These two are just like Captain America and Iron Man, except, you know, sadder.
Superman never made any money for saving the world.
And more religious. I can see the headlines already. Volkswagen dealer and friend debunk foundational cornerstone of biology. I'm mean in this one. I'm not even wearing my mean jacket, and I'm mean in this one. Not like Robert Sepper mean, but mean. This isn't to say that you need a formal education to do good science, but when you're regularly messing up the basics...
That's called foreshadowing.
When you mess up the basics, don't have a formal education, and you're trying to debunk one of the most robust theories in science, period, I do reserve the right to make fun of you a little for it. Now, I first encountered Donnie in 2020. He reached out to me to have a conversation after he saw my debate, quote unquote, with convicted domestic abuser Kent Hovind. Things were very cordial over the next several months, and we had several discussions, but trouble was brewing. Maybe this is where it started, or maybe this is just when I first started noticing, because I like to see the best in people, but Donnie began to grow increasingly erratic. I realize that this sounds super sinister, but I'm just telling it like it is. Essentially, Donnie would just go off on people, myself included, in the comments section or in the side chats of videos, And then afterwards, usually within 24 to 48 hours, he would resume cordial dialogue as if nothing had ever happened. These little expressions of verbal diarrhea would range from simple rage coping to outright insults, and especially with Raw Matt, sometimes like threats. This cycle of cordiality and schoolyard insult slinging has been the experience of myself and many friends of the channel. Eventually, every one of us has come to the conclusion that he simply isn't worth our time and we've cut contact. So then, Donnie finds someone new to pester and the cycle repeats itself once more. And that's kind of the purpose of this video, to act as like a PSA for why you, an individual who may have Googled or YouTubed Standing for Truth's name, shouldn't interact with him, why he and Raw Matt aren't worth your time. So, let's go over some examples, shall we? Now there's a lot to cover, so I'm going to go ahead and, for the ease of your content consumption, break down these Donnie and sometimes Raw Matthew behaviors into a few key categories. A numbered list, as it were. Number 1 is erratic flip-flopping. Number 2, platforming domestic abusers. Number 3, faking a published paper. Number 4, homophobic and also homoerotic thumbnails, sometimes both at the same time. Number 5, schoolyard name-calling and light threats. And finally, number 6, my favorite, running from debates or conversations. We'll start with the erratic flip-flopping, and we're going to start, of course, with my personal experience with this, because it was actually the erratic flip-flopping that led me to cut ties with Standing for Truth and stop interacting with him on any kind of cordial or friendly basis. The straw that broke the camel's back for me was the events that occurred after the publishing of my first bite-sized bust video, Limestone. This isn't to say that his behavior was never erratic before that, but I had always kind of chalked it up to things getting heated in a comment section, or, the regular rigmarole that goes with having an online debate or discussion that's filmed. Things get heated, people get emotional, it is what it is. But this one, well, you'll see. So I released my Limestone video, and George Bond, who is a friend of Standing for Truth's channel, shows up in my comments section asking me if I would debate a one Mr. McQueen, or Professor McQueen as Standing for Truth tends to call him. McQueen had been showing up on Standing for Truth's channel regularly at the time to argue for a young Earth creationist interpretation of geology.
To
refresh your memory, McQueen is the guy who supposes that you can find blood, human blood, in oil, because all oil was created during Noah's flood, as with all the other fossil fuels, and since that flood killed a ton of people, and oil is from organic material, humans would have been included in that organic material, hence blood in oil.
Are you serious?
Not, that oil and coal and things like that were actually formed by carboniferous plants, but, human blood, right? Reasonable, right? He's also the same guy that proposes he's going to just solve the heat problem. Him and George Bond, a random Australian guy, are going to sit down and solve the heat problem, that nitpicky little issue I consistently bring up on this channel as a preclusion to the Noachian deluge. They're going to solve it.
George and I will continue to work all during the month of November on the mathematics of this.
That thing that Answers in Genesis and Institute for Creation Research say literally cannot be solved at present without a miracle. But yeah, McQueen's got it. Not that we have any numbers yet. And shortly after George Bond's comments in my comment section, Standing for Truth shoots me an email. Hey Erica, my nemesis. Haha, JK. How's it going? George asked me to send you an email. I hope all is well. Then he proceeds to explain how busy McQueen is and says, he asked us to find the best candidate for a discussion. We have a few candidates who are interested, but after enjoying your recent video, McQueen specifically asked if you would be up for a discussion. As you know, McQueen is very cordial and respectful, and therefore a discussion or debate would be that type of interaction. Cordial, respectful, etc. No obligations, of course, but if you are interested, then that would be awesome. The debate or discussion would take place on my channel, but for full fairness, as always, a guest co-mod of your choice is always available. I have absolutely zero animosity towards you, and although we disagree on the whole creation versus evolution debate, I think you are a solid, reasonable person who keeps things respectful and easygoing in discussions and email interactions. Talk later. Oh, so friendly. So nice. We love to see it, Donnie. Longtime viewers of the channel will remember that this interaction came shortly after my creation and release of a video to Standing for Truth in particular that provided a list of challenges that I said, until you even attempt to answer these questions, we're done interacting, because I feel like you're not providing me with the mutual respect that I provide you, in that when he would ask these challenging questions, I would do these big, long, deep dives and answer them to the best of my ability, and I felt like he wasn't giving me that same respect. My ultimatum was basically answer these questions or try to answer them, or we're not going to interact anymore. I simply refuse to interact with bad faith actors on the internet. I said, meaning every word. So I respond saying a lot of different things, but basically sticking to my guns. The too long didn't read at the bottom says I would love to debate McQueen. In fact, I'm excited by the potential opportunity, but I want to do it on a neutral platform. Happy with you as a mod, though. Historically, I haven't really minded Standing for Truth as a mod. He tends to be very hands-off and give people plenty of time to speak. Of course, now I think that that's because he really doesn't care about the outcome of the debate. He's just gonna say that his side won anyway. So he shoots back with, hey, no problem at all, and I appreciate your response. We found somebody else who was willing to do the discussion on my channel. Thanks again, Standing for Truth. So a couple of days later, we both find ourselves in the live chat of an after show. And this exchange happens. Things are initially relatively chill in the live chat to the degree that Standing for Truth is actually using emojis and saying things like LOL. Then, one of his friends comes in and asks me a relatively simple question. Redefine Living asks, Erica, are you willing to debate Indiana Joe on that, or are you not an expert again? Longtime viewers will, of course, remember the time that Donnie's channel made a supercut of all the times that I have said I'm not a geneticist, because remember, to them, speaking outside of your field with authority, a good thing, and admitting your limits is not good, actually. So I shoot back with, Redefine Living, I wanted to debate McQueen, but I promised my audience I wouldn't appear on Standing for Truth's channel until he answers my questions, and evidently they wouldn't debate on Modern Day Debate. So yeah, I will totally debate Indiana Joe. I'll do it on MDD in a heartbeat. Standing for Truth could even mod, for all I care. And Donnie, like a crazed goblin leaping from the rafters, comes in with, Gutsick makes excuses. She's tired of being refuted. I've got someone for McQueen and for Joseph. It's her loss, not ours. I wouldn't want to debate the pros either. Remember how Kevin Anderson demolished Jackson Wheat? Man, all I'm doing is telling them what I told you when you emailed me. No need to get so touchy. We've answered all your questions, and you've answered none of ours, Gutsick. You've got mad excuse-making skills, almost as good as your dodgeball skills. Oh, I forgot to tell you, Standing for Truth likes to constantly make references to the movie Dodgeball, and I like to think that this is, in line with what young Earth creationists are usually doing, which is being 1 to 2 decades late on things, whether it's science or good comedy movies, which means maybe in 5 years we'll get like the Hangover references, or he'll call us like 21 Jump Street or something like that. Nah, Gutsick Gibbon, all our videos and articles. I'm not interested in your lies and excuses. You clearly don't understand the material, as Joe Hubbard demonstrated sufficiently the other day. Indiana Joe is similar to McQueen, but he cosplays as Indiana Jones, right? And of course, he doesn't know the difference between organic and inorganic limestone, nor does he know how to use diagnostic characteristics to tell the difference in the field or in a lab, which means their limestone problem to date still remains unsolved. But I shoot back anyways with, Standing for Truth, like, you just got mad at me for explaining why I wouldn't debate on your channel when all I did is say the exact thing I told you. Well, I only asked Team Dodgeball first, knowing they will decline, to show everybody that they had their chance. I count on the decline in order that I can go down the list and get the next best person. Well, I only asked you out because I felt bad for you. This is just that. It's a really lame and embarrassing coping strategy. Standing for Truth, I mean, you're being super vitriolic to me for literally just telling them what I told you. No provocation. Gutsick, your excuses are exhausting. Standing for Truth, this is probably the weirdest exchange I've had with you. I am baffled. It's really this simple. I have 20 plus people willing to debate anytime, both creationists and evos. I simply ask Team Dodgeball first to prove they dodge and they fall for it, thinking they're smart. A clever ruse. He's playing 4D chess over here. Did you really think I wanted you to debate McQueen over Jordan? Or you over the person debating Hubbard? The answer is no. You seem to think it's our loss when it's your loss. You're the one on need or damage control. Standing for truth, if that's genuinely true, it's incomprehensibly strange to me. Also, George Bond showed your hand. He revealed that McQueen specifically asked to debate me on Limestone. I have zero sympathy for these Team Dodgeball excuses. I have had over 100 debates on all sorts of atheist or Christian channels. I don't complain about what channel a debate is on like these wimps. Standing for truth, I'm not down to interact with you when you're like this. Sorry, unnecessary vitriol isn't my sped.
Stop it. Get some help.
So that was the end of my cordial interactions with Donnie. That was so beyond weird to me, and I thought, I don't know if he's like trying some new mood stabilizers or if he just got drunk and showed up on that after show, but either way, I was already fed up with our Volkswagen dealing friend here for not answering pretty basic, straightforward questions and instead kind of obfuscating, dancing, if you will. We'll talk more about that later. But I'm not the only person this has happened to. It's actually happened several times. Initially, Donnie was a pretty big fan of my friend and friend of the channel, Dapper Dino, and this is evidenced by his willingness to allow Dapper to be a moderator via email correspondence. But ever since Dapper made a debunking video specifically against Raw Matt, Donnie has started kind of like losing his mind about the whole thing, and it has sort of devolved into calling Dapper Dino Diaper Dino. Diaper Dino? He's a snowflake. Cowards like Diaper Dino spend 99% attacking Kent simply because they're jealous, lonely, a snowflake, and want to be Kent. And adds a diaper refuting to his Dino avatar. He should be proud of his inner estrogen. And like, you know, the real crime here is how unfunny that is as a nickname. Dipshit Dino was right there. This has also happened with Creation Myths, or Dr. Dan Stern-Carnell, another friend of the channel. Dan is an evolutionary biologist and has chatted with Donnie many times. Naturally, and unsurprisingly, Donnie has gone back and forth between telling Dan he appreciates his expertise and basically agrees with him on everything.
There's a range. It's not that big a range.
What about, okay, but now I understand, okay? Because you don't say a lot that I necessarily disagree with in terms of the science of all this, right?
To calling him Dodgeball Dan and photoshopping pictures of himself and Dan interacting in various, sometimes homoerotic ways. And we will get back to this one as well. I learned I enjoy discussion with Dan when it's relatively equally timed and cordial, and I do apologize for the animosity in our past. We are all human and we share this planet together. Getting along is important to me in 2021, LOL. Donnie does not limit his unpredictable vitriol to perceived atheists, however. He will readily insult evolution-accepting Christians.
And which is why Strawman Swamidas would never publish in the AIG journal.
Okay.
Old Earth creationists, and even other young Earth creationists who disagree with him. Sal Cordova of Evidence and Reasons and Peter of Paleologos are both young Earth creationists who have caught the ire of Donnie. Sal for his defense of Kent Hovind's ex-wife Cindy, and Peter for holding several conventional anthropological opinions. And we're talking like going from calling these other young Earth creationists brother to just telling them that they're not a real Christian. Ha ha ha, Brother Sal, one of our videos went viral. Let me get it for you. Sal Cordova is a fraud and an infiltrator. Stay away from him. He's a Christian and literally said we should use BCE instead of BC because it offends atheists. Let them be offended. Sick.
What a baby.
Similarly, Peter, another young Earth creationist, argued correctly that Australopithecus sediba is not, in fact, a combination of human and ape bones. After going off in the comments section, Donnie retreated to the live chat and said this: Paleologos is 99% evolutionist, 1% YEC, and he's not a good debater. I would never host him. Peter responded in a rather Christ-like fashion, saying, I'm completely happy to agree to disagree on all our differences. I'm not out here to attack you, and standing for truth, backed down. Haha, it's all good. You know I love you as a spiritual brother, Paleologos. I'm sure we both have thick skin. Gotta have it when you're on YouTube. LOL. Apologies if I ever said anything that came across as offensive to you. God bless. Even though we may disagree on certain things, you are a brother in Christ, and the love for brethren is very important. And then, shortly after that, Paleologos criticized Kent Hovind for one of the many stupid things Kent has said, and Standing for Truth just kind of said, nah, Paleologos isn't saved. In fact, it's worse than that. He's a Catholic. Then later, Standing for Truth called Peter a coward, and Peter responded with a kind Bible verse, so Standing for Truth got embarrassed and deleted the initial comment. It's classic stuff. The best part about it? Peter is actually a very well-read high school graduate, and Donnie is in his 30s. Untangle that behavioral canyon. Love thy neighbor, am I right? But I mean, a lot of this simply has to be a misunderstanding, because if there's one thing Donnie Deals loves, it's a cordial and respectful dialogue.
Fantastic debate. I do want to thank you both for keeping it civil, respectful, and sophisticated. Let's just be respectful, sophisticated, and sophisticated. And I also want to make sure that the debaters, no matter who they are feeling respected, or a very engaging, very respectful, technical and sophisticated debate. Cordial, very respectful. So I do thank you for that.
I've had nothing but good things said about my moderating. This includes feedback from many atheists. I think you're probably just a big whiny baby who needs to grow hair on his legs. I've wrestled, won numerous medals. I've coached wrestling. I've done kickboxing and judo for years. Why am I telling you all this? Well, it's because I know a pussy-ass bitch when I see one, and you are definitely one. Get off my channel and don't talk to me again, you weirdo.
Civil, respectful, and sophisticated. Pussy
ass bitch.
But outside of these weird mood swings, we have many other worrying behaviors. The first is going to have to be the feverish promotion of Kent Hovind on his YouTube channel. Kent Hovind, of course, is a convicted domestic abuser, currently on wife number 4. So to get around this inconvenient truth, Donnie has essentially just said, like, the courts are wrong on this one, guys. Sorry, to justify keeping Kent on.
I am shocked. Shocked. Well, not that shocked.
The evidence is out there, he'll say. Kent is actually innocent. Go to www.kenthovandinnocent.com to see for yourself. All of the wives were wrong. My hypothesis here is that it's pretty clear that his videos do best when Kent is in them. In fact, with the top 50 videos taken into account, Kent is in 31 of them, because Kent brings his bonkers audience along with him wherever he goes. And you know, you gotta secure that commune demographic. But yeah, I think Donnie knows that Kent bolsters his rather withered channel, and so he's just gonna insist that everyone is wrong, besides him and Kent, on everything. Oh, and if you have any doubts on this, I can just point you to the recent rather revolting behavior where Donnie just kind of simply admitted that if you have enough subs, beating your wife is just okay.
200K subs and a massive audience for each and every one of his live show appearances. Don't give a crap about Cindy. Sorry, buddy.
Sake, man, you amateur.
I can't.
Donnie and Rahmat are also known for their thumbnails and community posts, which can be hateful to the LGBTQ community. They also evidently have a thing for eggs, and remember, of course, the homoerotic photoshops of Donnie wrestling Dan. Rahmat himself, of course, should be appreciated for the time he faked the published paper in PLOS, as well as the time he celebrated the death of a science educator who covered evolution. And yes, I do mean celebrate.
We could talk about the time they had Amy Newman, a trans woman, on the channel and did absolutely nothing about the dozens and dozens of hateful and transphobic comments. Or the inaction on racist comments towards Ian Chen, who is of Asian descent and was called Lo Mein Boy in the side chat. And then, of course, there's the sexism, where it isn't just inaction, but active promotion. I, of course, am the gutsickgibbon in this comments and simply can't be the leader of Team Dodgeball. I must be a cheerleader. Alas, I am a woman.
Yeah, I do know that Eve come up from hell through the woman. And Satan knows that, and all his children knows that now, and that's why they're pushing the woman.
And you gotta include this gem where Ramat says he could break Dan in half on a bad day. But yeah, Donnie, you guys are the adults, right?
Now, I already showed you how Donnie effectively runs from conversations with me by basically insisting that he won't chat with me unless it's on his channel where he can make money off of it, and I'm just simply not down with that. There's a little bit more to it, but we'll get into that a little bit more in the second half of the video. That's right, we're not even halfway through the video yet. But first, I want to talk to you about how Donnie Deals runs from Dr. Dan Stern Cardinal. Yeah, the guy he calls Dodgeball Dan.
Dan has been willing to chat with Donnie on a neutral platform since his channel started, but Donnie always finds a reason to weasel out of it, even when he has publicly agreed to have the conversation. Recently, creationist YouTuber Rebecca of the Bread of Life channel had Donnie on to talk about endogenous retroviruses. Dan was in the chat, and so Donnie did his usual flip-flop.
Absolutely. And I just pulled up from my phone the chat just to see the triggered atheist. Creation Myth says, I don't think SFT understands the question. No, I don't think Creation Myth, aka Dodgeball Dan, understands just how badly his ERV argument has been demolished. Most evolutionists won't even bring up the second part to the argument. Only the informed ones like Dan. And credit where credit is due. Dan's probably the best of the best, you know? And him and I do get passionate, but, you know, I do respect his knowledge for sure. And I've learned a lot from the critics.
And shortly after, Dan was on Rebecca's channel and offered to chat with Standing for Truth.
This would also be really, Donnie, this would be easier if we could just do it ourselves instead of having Rebecca here, who is great at this, but like having her relay the arguments back and forth, because when you were here, she was like, oh, I watched Dr. Dan's video. What about this? And now we're here. And I'm going, yeah, I took notes. And she's like, oh, but he said this. Like, this would be so much easier. Just talk to me. This would be so much easier.
This is also something that has happened to another friend of the channel, Jackson Wheat, whereby Standing for Truth says he's happy to debate him and then dodges him. I know, because I tried to organize it myself. He's down and then he just ghosts. It's the Standing for Truth way. He runs from anyone he deems competent.
Why are you running? Why are you running?
Really, I just wanted to put these receipts out there for anybody who might be considering going on Standing for Truth's channel, interacting with him or Ramat generally. And this is mainly just because I've already gone through the experience and so have like dozens of other people that I know. This is your avoid falling into the Standing for Truth is a bad faith actor pipeline video. So I have established that Donnie and Ramat are fairly hateful and fairly unhinged, at least in my opinion. But the Donnie Deals audience, as small as it may be, would simply look at this video and say ad hominem. Gutsickgibbon simply cannot handle the power and irrefutability of our good YEC arguments, hence she has to resort to attacking our character. Well, dear viewer, someone didn't pay attention to the foreshadowing at the beginning of the video. You see what I did there? Donnie is a jerk, yes, but he is also heinously, unapologetically wrong about just about everything he deigns to talk about. He's not wrong because he is a manic Canadian. He is wrong and he's a manic Canadian. We call this Robert Sepper syndrome. So, let's hit Donnie Deals and the boys with the second and more gargantuan portion of this video. Let us first discuss the inciting incident. Travel back in time with me a moment, dear viewer, to the last video that I had made specifically aimed at Donnie Deals, standing for truth. It was titled something along the lines of, I'm probably done with these creationists, and then in parentheses it was like 3 hours again, sorry, because, I tend to be a little bit long-winded, occasionally. Not always, but here, yes. It released in late October 2020, so about a year and a half ago now, and the ending of the video presented a series of challenging questions to the Standing for Truth channel, many of which had been asked by me several times before and received either bad answers or no answers at all. Really, the purpose of the video was to outline my frustration with dialoguing with a channel that wanted to ask questions and pose challenges, but never actually answer any of them. And I pledged not to address the channel again until someone had given the old college try to these series of questions, like actually attempted to answer them in a robust way. And that went okay, sometimes I can't help myself. But almost immediately after the video released, I received an email from Donnie promising me that I would receive a long-form video response and a text response. He was going to give me both. Now, take a moment and guess if that ever happened. Go on. Indulge me. Now, Ramat made a predictably insane stab at it where he, among other things, didn't understand what a half-life is. These guys are going to debunk radiometric dating, you guys. But since this was technically a response, an attempt at answering the questions, I went ahead and answered it in 2 overly gratuitous 2-hour video installments, because no one has ever accused me of not being thorough. But like I said, and pardon my language, but they were piss poor, right? So I ended my second video with basically none of this works, try again, and then I received radio silence. That is, until the first episode of my Bite-Sized Bus series came out, Limestone, and then you remember, of course, from earlier in this video, the entire McQueen thing happened. Sprinkled in there were a couple of attempts at solving the heat problem as well. Again, a classic issue that I bring up on this channel all the time, and I say this with no exaggeration, these attempts actually revealed a misunderstanding of how the laws of thermodynamics work. So needless to say, the problem remains unsolved. So the takeaway of phase 2, I'm doing phases because Donnie loves Marvel, is basically a series of 3-hour-long passive-aggressive midnight streams by the Standing for Truth channel that try to address problems that I've posed on my channel without actually directly mentioning my name. Something that Donnie stole from me, by the way. Phase 1, of course, was the lead up to the ceasing of contact and interaction with Donnie. All the while, the questions that I had posed in late October of 2020 remain largely unanswered. Until, that is, Donnie initiates phase 3, whereby he attempts to, let's call it what it is, bully new young Earth creationist YouTuber Peter of Paleologos. You see how I'm kind of taking the events from earlier and sticking them into an official timeline? That's what you call narrative flow. So Peter, like I said, young Earth creationist, but holds several conventional anthropological opinions, things like affirming the bipedality of Australopiths, which is something that is just well understood, but something that most young Earth creationists will just deny to the end. And Standing for Truth descended on his channel and started kind of like, again, call it what it is, bullying Peter, attempting to bully Peter in his comment section. And Peter did not need my help. He was perfectly fine. He responded with poise and elegance to all of Standing for Truth's attempts at getting a rise out of him, usually with things like calm rebuttals to the stuff Standing was saying and Bible verses sometimes. But that being said, it still really pissed me off that we have Donnie, the 30-year-old grown man, condescending to a young man who actually has more published work than the adult trying to bully him. This work is technically in the Answers Research Journal, which is a young Earth creationist journal, so as much as I respect Peter, I don't put this on par with actual peer-reviewed published work, but in Standing's eyes, these two are equivalent.
And which is why Strawman Swamidas would never publish in the AIG journal.
So why he feels that he can talk down to Peter is completely beyond me. Now, Peter certainly did not need me to intervene. He can handle himself. But I went ahead and did so anyway because I like to fight. No, actually because Donnie made some absolutely batshit comment about how I hadn't addressed the questions he posed to me. I guess he just thought no one would notice, that he's just taking the thing that I did and saying he did this. It's like that little comic. But I felt the need to respond because I just had to hammer home the insanity of saying that it was me, actually, who had not been responding to him. Yeah, maybe in the multiverse of madness, Donnie. That was another one. Freebie, just for you, Marvel references. And that, dear viewers, how we come full circle to Phase 4, where we've finally received, after months, the long-awaited 4-hour midnight ramble stream with Donnie and Ramat answering the questions that I posed in that particular comment, which is, of course, very revealing because it means he knows he has not actually answered them. So, you know, calling the bluff, but I guess he really just does think that we're all that stupid. And so with the entire history of my interactions with Donnie and Ramat out of the way, we're gonna work through this entire 4-hour monstrosity. Not, mind you, because it's chock full of brand new material and new arguments. In fact, whenever they make a repeated claim that I've already addressed in a deep dive, I'm just going to take a clip from that deep dive and stick it in there, just so you can really appreciate how the Standing for Truth channel uses strategies of obfuscation to make it seem like there's actually a dialogue going on and that they're actually responding in good faith. The primary means by which the Standing for Truth channel maintains a false pretense of good faith dialogue is by utilizing a strategy that I'm calling the Donnie Deals fallacy. This is an argument style that works something like this. I'll present an issue, the heat problem, for example, and Donnie will respond with, the heat problem isn't an issue for young Earth creationism because of A. I will look at that and create a 2-hour deep dive video where I say, nope, it's still a problem because of B. A does not work because of B. And then Donnie will respond in turn with another very long midnight stream that says, but gutsickgibbon, have you considered A? So he's just reasserting the first point and not addressing the critique of that initial point. The second strategy is taking all those Donnie Deals fallacies and tucking them into 4-hour midnight streams that they know no one will ever watch. Now, I realize that I too make very long videos, but you know, mine are edited and fun. So as we go through this video, again, I'll be responding to repeated arguments or Donnie Deals fallacies to really illuminate how cowardly Donnie is when it comes to just like nutting up and addressing critiques. The video begins as usual with a bunch of shilling for their own channel.
Matt, what do you think? The Gibbon that's sick to her stomach. She's going to be sick for weeks after this dismantling.
Yeah, no doubt.
Damn, bro, you got the whole squad laughing.
Before Donnie and Ramat decide to cover an interview that I did with Seth Andrews titled The Human Monkey. Now this is in reference to the law of monophily, in that humans are still monkeys given we evolved from a more ancient monkey in the same way that we are still mammals even though we evolved from a more ancient mammal. Now I've covered the nature of nested hierarchies many times on this channel, but I feel where I did it the best justice was in the video I created titled You Are Both a Monkey and an Ape, which you can probably find in the description. Put simply though, a nested hierarchy refers to the fact that organisms on this planet have suites of characteristics that, when organized, will nest within successively larger or successively smaller groups. This can be done with physical characteristics, whole genomes or just elements of the genome, but no matter how you do it, humans will nest with monkeys, first the haplorhines and then the catarrhines, and we will also nest further down the line with apes, both the hominoids and then the hominids. The legitimacy of nested hierarchies as a means by which to tell how closely related any two given species are rely on a single assumption, and that's that Mendel's laws of inheritance don't stop arbitrarily at any given point in time. Nested hierarchies have always troubled creationists of many different stripes, particularly now that genetics is continuing to recapitulate this idea that all organisms are related, and particularly that humans are apes. But Donnie kind of does a weird thing here. He insists that nested hierarchies are non-discriminatory data and that they can support common design just as much as they can support common descent. This is really strange and is a weird move because many creationists today still deny that nested hierarchies even exist at all.
Unfortunately, we're going to have to spend some time on what we call the non-discriminatory lines of evidence, or the lines of evidence that are really just agnostic to the debate. Classification systematics, nested hierarchies, the fact that we can classify various creatures and animals, and then the meat of this, the genetics, the best way to determine ancestry, right, Matt? It's not, a classification, a chart, or pictures, or illustrations, or a bone found in the dirt that's inherited sperm and egg. No, genes, traits, genetics, that's what's inherited sperm and egg. But we do share more with the great apes and primates in general. To classification systematics, we are, as Erica pointed out, haplorhine primates. Okay, classification systematics, phylogenetic systematics does not actually answer this question. This does not prove relationship any more than the fact that my books on young earth creation, theology, and soteriology can be grouped together in a greater group of books called Books on Christianity.
Okay, so at least we have the tacit admission that humans are actually primates and are subsequently apes. He even used the word haplorhine, so good on you there. However, his comparison of phylogenetic trees to inanimate objects like books is highly inappropriate for reasons he's already been corrected on. This is because objects like books, cars, and tools do not reproduce. Reproduction necessarily means that two organisms are related, the parent and the offspring. My mom reproduced and had me, but you don't have to be present at my birth to know this. The genome records it. My mom and I have more similar genomes than I do with my aunt, her sister, and me and my aunt have more similar genomes than I do with a stranger. This is a brute fact. More similar genomes both within and between species necessarily mean that the two individuals or two species are more closely related. Mendelian inheritance laws demand this. But I guess biological laws, two standing for truth, mean about as much as Kent Hovind's wife Cindy's testimony. Creationists like Standing for Truth accept this. Standing accepts that humans and Neanderthals are related. He accepts that dogs and wolves are related. But they think, I guess, that inheritance laws just kind of stop arbitrarily at some point, leaving no trace of discontinuity. An invisible barrier. This is, of course, the barrier between kinds, and there is nothing that exists to support its existence. As such, it's just easier for Standing and for Ramat to argue with Linnaean taxonomy, which utilizes physical traits to group organisms. It was how we did it before genetics was discovered.
I agree. It's they're too busy looking for absolutely only the similarities. They're discounting any of the differences because their goal is different than our goal. They want to connect everything because that's what they're starting with their presupposition, right? It's the conclusion driving the paradigm. So therefore, who cares about these big differences and small differences? We got to look at what matches and just throw everything else away.
Yeah, except you can quantify genomes, numerically speaking, right? And when we do that, humans and chimpanzees, panins, are more closely related to each other than either is to anything else. Physical characteristics corroborate this fact, which is why it's easier to use them when you teach someone this concept. But gosh, it's hard to argue with cold hard numbers, isn't it, Matt?
And one thing I wanted to state real quick about Carl Linnaeus is he actually didn't categorize humans alongside of apes with any idea of an evolutionary link. He did it with the same reasoning he used to categorize all life, which is that there are similarities he identified between species. That was it. They conflate this and they move it into their model, but they're just borrowing from ours. Because again, creationist, he believed there were separate created kinds. But, you gotta twist words around right.
So next, Ramat talks briefly about Carl Linnaeus, the father of taxonomy, who was, of course, a creationist and yet still grouped other apes with humans. And Ramat hits us with something so incomprehensible, it left me speechless.
And one thing I wanted to state real quick about Carl Linnaeus is he actually didn't categorize humans alongside of apes with any idea of an evolutionary link. He did it with the same reasoning he used to categorize all life, which is that there are similarities he identified between species.
Yeah, Ramat, that's the point. That Carl Linnaeus, a creationist, before the theory of evolution was ever put to paper, recognized that humans and other apes were the same type of organism. The same kind, if you will.
Again, creationist. He believed there were separate created kinds, but you gotta twist words around right.
So created kinds being a category for organisms above the species level is a relatively new idea. As such, Linnaeus would not have held to that. But I do hope you caught what Ramat just kind of accidentally did there, right? He's saying that using Linnaeus's categorization of kinds, something he agrees with, other apes group with humans. So we are all the same kind, hominids. Interesting, Ramat. I wonder if you'll stick to that. So next, Standing starts talking about amphibious vehicles.
Like here, we have a boat built for the ocean, okay, where that's the perfect environment for it when it comes to military firepower. We have a tank built for land, okay. I mean, the tank would not do good in the sea, and the boat would not do good on the land, but we've got the perfect intermediate that is designed, an amphibious assault vehicle, okay, military amphibious assault vehicle, that's actually built perfectly for the transition from what? Sea to land. And guess what? According to the evolutionists, because this fits nice and neat in the middle, apparently that proves relationship. No, these lines of evidence are agnostic. And I just wanted to give the audience visuals that, yeah, the audience can have some fun.
Which, again, vehicles don't reproduce, so this isn't an analogy that actually works because it's that reproduction that necessitates relatedness, not just the suites of physical characteristics. But that being said, this doesn't work within their own model very well either. It's obvious that the comparison is with the vehicles, that you have a boat, an amphibious vehicle, and a tank, and each of these is their own created kind, its own designed group. And this is supposed to equate roughly to something along the lines of Eusthenopteron, Tiktaalik, and some generic tetrapod. But the problem is, we don't just have those three. It's not just some approximate intermediate that shares the traits of the former and the latter. We also bridge the gap between Eusthenopteron and Tiktaalik, or the boat and the amphibious vehicle, and Tiktaalik and the tetrapods, or the amphibious vehicle and the tank. Are Acanthostega and Ichthyostega their own kinds as well? As you can see, the problem is that this isn't a model. It's obfuscation. It's meant to distract.
So it's a naming system invented by creationists who didn't even believe in evolution. And if you try to use it, if you're an evolutionist, you actually run into what's known as the taxonomy boundary paradox because nothing converges. There's individual lines of ancestry. So anyway.
Oh, the taxonomic boundary paradox. Allow me to direct you to January 21st, 2021.
First, he starts off with this gangbuster sentence. The taxonomic boundary paradox already draws the line. The taxonomic boundary paradox was a problem that only applied to Linnaean taxonomy, which was superseded by phylogenetics decades ago. I'm not kidding. We're starting off with something so dumb that I can't help but think that Ramat doesn't know what the taxonomic boundary paradox actually is. For instance, if we do a quick Google search, the look, I did this earlier, which is why I want to show you how easy it is. You even got pictures, how easy it is to actually find what you're looking for here. The taxonomic boundary paradox refers to the conflict between traditional rank-based classification of life and living things. And over in the contents, the resolution is part 3 and talks about how phylogeny, phylogenetics, and the understanding of what a monophyletic group is, and the understanding that an ancestor and all of its lineages are indeed a monophyly, solve the problem. The solution is provided by cladistic classification, in which each group is composed of an ancestor and all its descendant populations, called a monophyly.
Then Ramat goes on a screed for a little bit about how I went to the Faithos Forum and I've been on the Pagan podcast, and he's like, she's never going on Christian channels. And yes, I have. Yes, I am. All you have to do is Google my name and all of my podcast appearances and YouTube channel appearances pop up. In fact, I've been on several channels talking about how evolution and religion don't necessarily have to go against one another. They can live very copacetically, but they can't with young earth creationism, now can they?
That's why it's so funny when she made her videos a long time ago. She said for a little bit that, I'm not interested in the young earth creation versus evolution debate, and this isn't going to be my full-time thing. She even said it on the podcast that, I just did this for a little while, now it's for life. She admitted she's going to be doing this forever.
This is actually true. I wasn't planning on doing the young earth creationist debunks forever, but it turns out this is what people like to see, and I do have fun doing them. And then there's also the fact where I just can't stop making money off of Standing for Truth and Raw Matt's bad videos. So Standing for Truth makes the car analogy again. And let me show you what happens.
And I've done a ton of debates lately.
Hold the phone, ladies and gentlemen. It appears as if we have another vehicle analogy, which again, they don't reproduce, so it doesn't work. But let's take a closer look, since this is Raw Matt and Donnie's understanding of phylogeny. Let's take a little bit peek here, okay? So we have our sedan. The sedan is maybe analogous to a species. And the sedan is all by itself over here. It's only in the sedan species alone. But when we take the category a bit higher to vehicles with four wheels, it nests with the SUV. And then the SUV and the sedan nest with our friend the semi-truck because they're all land-based vehicles. The semi-truck, of course, can't go down to the vehicle with four wheels category because it's got a bunch more wheels. And then our sedan, our SUV, and our semi-truck get to nest with an airplane because all of these guys are engine-powered vehicles. And you might be thinking, well, maybe that's like the family level. But what's this? It appears that the sedan, the SUV, the semi-truck, and the airplane all nest in the unpowered vehicle category with the bicycle. So sedans, SUVs, semi-trucks, and airplanes are all powered vehicles. So, it's right there. It says engine-powered vehicles. So they would not nest within unpowered vehicles. This should just say vehicles. These are the guys overturning evolution. They read a quote from Nathaniel Jensen that says, since humans design in nested hierarchies, God must have done so as well, since humans were created in God's image. Again, completely forgetting the role that reproduction and inheritance play in determining how closely related organisms or species are. And then they promise us this.
We are going to demolish this video when we get into the differentiating lines of evidence, specifically in genetics. Matt, over to you, brother.
Yeah, here's the introduction into cladistics. Look at how they admit that it starts with assumptions. The definition of phylogeny is the assumption. So you can't do any of these taxonomic labeling and groupings without starting with the assumption of evolution being true already to begin with. And that's what we're questioning. So why in the world would we start with their assumption?
Okay, so Ramat is mad that there are assumptions in phylogeny, and there are. As you can see in the background, the assumptions of phylogenetic analyses in particular is 1, organisms are related by descent from a common ancestor, 2, characteristics change over time as organisms evolve, and 3, nucleids are created by binary splitting. Young Earth creationists, including Donnie and Ramat, don't disagree with 2 and 3. They have a problem with 1 as an assumption. So these 3 are assumptions for running a phylogenetic analysis. But what about common descent? What is the assumption of common descent? Well, I told you earlier. The assumption of common descent, that organisms can trace their lineage back to a universal common ancestor, is simply that reproduction and the laws of inheritance do not stop at some arbitrary point in time. Essentially, reproduction and the laws of inheritance work the same way during the diversification of all of these canids, from the Cape fox to the maned wolf to the gray wolf to the dog, as they did in the diversification of ancient canids from ancient ursids. Descent with modification to them is all fine and dandy in these canids here, but you take it back too far and suddenly all of it just stops working. The laws of inheritance, all of the mechanisms of evolution that they accept, like natural selection, they just stop working. Why? What is the genetic mechanism that prevents this type of diversification? Alternatively, how do we genetically determine a kind? How do we know that all canids are a single kind and separate from the ursids? Where does Amphicyonid, the ancestral group potentially to canids and ursids, fit in? Is it a part of one of their kinds? Is it its own kind? Genetically, it doesn't work today, so I very much doubt they can answer that question about organisms that lived in the past. As such, unless Donnie and Ramat can present a genetic line for kinds, a line in the sand, a boundary that natural selection and the laws of inheritance cannot cross, then this is an appropriate assumption to make. The only assumption is that genetics works the same in the past as it does now, that speciation works the same in the past as it does now. This is no more inappropriate than assuming that gravity works the same here as it does here.
Evolutionary theory convergence refers to the origination of identical or highly similar structures through independent evolutionary pathways rather than inheritance from a common ancestor.
So Donnie continues to read this quote from evolutionnews.com, which is an intelligent design organization very much against evolution news, as it were. And his whole point is that how can we get convergent evolution? It's already so unlikely that we can evolve an eye once. How can we evolve it multiple times? But convergent evolution isn't talking about identical structures evolving twice under random circumstances. It's referring to the fact that similar structures will evolve under similar pressures. The kicker is, though, they're not identical. This is why we have multiple different types of powered flight in creatures. It's kind of like how rivers on opposite sides of the world flowing through similar types of rock will carve similar but not identical paths. It's just responses to similar variables.
As a result, even if Darwinian theory were true, one could never be sure whether similar features shared by two fossils, okay, notice this is important, resulted from convergence or from common ancestry. If similar structures can evolve and re-evolve repeatedly, then fossils can. This is why fossils are low quality, low confidence evidence and data. When you're looking at a bone in the dirt, you're looking at these isolated fragments. How can you tell the difference between homology and convergent evolution? Okay, you can't really. There's a lot of guesswork. There's a lot of inference. Remember, fossils are fickle, and a bone found in the dirt will sing any song that you want it to sing, okay?
Guys, this is not difficult stuff. This is evolutionary biology 101. A homologous trait is a trait that is found in the proposed ancestor and the proposed descendants and is identical in both, more or less, slight tweaks, ontogenetically at least present or would proceed to completion. Convergent evolution yields traits that are not identical but perform similar functions. It's not that hard. Limb structure, for example, is homologous in all tetrapods, even the ones that don't develop the limbs. In cetaceans, for example, sometimes something goes wrong ontogenetically and their hind flippers continue to develop. They maintain the ancestral tetrapod pattern. Convergent evolution, on the other hand, occurred in haplorhine primates and in guinea pigs, both lineages of which don't have the ability to synthesize their own vitamin C due to a genetic break. However, this break occurs in different locations in all guinea pigs as compared to all primates. That's how we know that this is convergent rather than homologous. Let's apply this briefly to the fossil record. Humans are bipeds. Chimpanzees are knuckle walkers. Australopiths are bipeds, so it is more likely that Australopiths are ancestral to humans than that they are ancestral to chimpanzees. Now, this number, this likelihood number, goes through the roof astronomically when we take into account all of the other characteristics that are shared between Australopiths and humans that chimpanzees lack. It is not one single trait that leads to this relationship, but a preponderance of traits.
I want to go over this part here. In fact, cladistics assumes evolutionary ancestry by default, and they admit this. They assume a tree exists. They assume whatever organisms they're looking at go back to a common ancestor before doing their work. Assume evolution to prove evolution. It's circular.
Yes, and until you can provide a reason, a genetic stopgap for your kinds or for the limitations of the mechanisms of evolution, it's appropriate. Gravity works here, but not here. You gotta have a precedent for this discrepancy, boys. Moreover, and this is the weirdest part to me, common ancestry as an assumption is used for smaller groups of organisms as well, which means they have to make that assumption for their kinds to work. Why do you assume a common ancestor for all canids, but not all life, guys?
We could go on all day with these quotes.
Yeah, I know. The only thing original out of this video so far is that sedans aren't powered vehicles. And if you go back and look at all these clips, every single quote so far has been from a creationist source.
We got probably about 5 slides of like 50 examples of convergent evolution, echolocation systems being one of them, various different types of complex proteins. All right, there's something called incomplete lineage sorting, where depending on the gene that you look at, you're going to get totally different trees. But for sake of time, we're going to move on.
I can't speak to the biochem stuff, but as far as the macroscopic stuff here goes, it's different types of echolocation that evolved under different pressures over long periods of time. That's how it is with every example of convergent evolution in macroscopic organisms. And many times, the evidence is preserved of this convergent evolution. For example, we have transitional sharks as they're developing their streamlined bodies. We have transitional cetaceans as they are as well. And we have transitional ichthyosaurs or marine reptiles. Then Ramat gets mad that we don't hold to gradualism anymore, and things like punctuated equilibrium and stasis are on the table and don't hurt evolution. He calls them contradictions. And that's just being mad that science changes, right? Darwin didn't know about genetics either, but it's a pretty big helper for evolutionary theory, isn't it? I'm sure we'll get to that part later. So next, Ramat wants to talk about differences between humans and other apes. Specifically, actually, he wants to talk about the difference between humans and primates, because he does not consider humans to be primates. Yes, I know what he said about the Carl Linnaeus stuff earlier. That doesn't matter anymore. So he pulls up a video to talk about the difference between human hair and animal fur. And to longtime viewers, this woman who's giving the presentation may look a bit familiar because I covered this video in October of 2020, and here's that clip.
We need to talk just a little bit about the distinct differences between human hair and animal fur, all right? Because evolutionists like to say, well, because we share these traits with animals, it's part of that evidence they'd like to call that we've descended from a common ancestor. And that is just not the case, all right? God equipped us each with exactly what we needed to survive in our environment. So even the FBI on their website had to acknowledge that human hair is distinctly different from animal fur. Now, if you take a look, you're going to see the distinct difference between human and animals, all right? If we look at the medulla pattern of this primate right here, this pattern running up the center, looks distinctly different from human hair, all right? Primate fur is distinctly different from human hair. There are no similarities at all in their medulla patterns. Very important.
I hope for her sake that this was prior to the release of the paper in 2014, which used a scanning electron microscope to compare human hair medulla to those of chimps and orangutans, and found that human hair does not differ significantly to the anthropoid primates, and in fact is actually very similar to that of a chimpanzee. Go figure.
So, clearly when she was saying, oh, it's exactly the same, and then she just moved on, it's not the same. It's not even remotely the same. So it's just more nonsense, just mixed in, thrown out to an audience that's not paying attention, doesn't know the difference. So,
God, can you just feel the irony of that statement? And the worst part about it is that clip where I previously covered the video he presented, and by the way, it was in July of 2020, so it's even older. He said even more time to view it, was actually from a video that I made for specifically Ramat. He didn't even watch it. Tisk, Ramat. Very weaselly behavior on your part. But also, evaluate the evidence put forward for each respective side for a moment, if you will. Put your critical thinking cap on. Ramat came to the table with a video interview with a young Earth creationist for a young Earth creationist organization, and I came with multiple papers. So you can just kind of take that how you will, mull it over. But, I can understand Ramat is allergic to peer review, which is why he faked that paper. Now Ramat is going to list a bunch of different things that humans have that primates lack, or that primates have and humans lack. And I really love when Raw Matt goes on these kind of tirades on this particular topic, because he is always wrong on almost, if not all of it. But what do we expect from a guy who wrote a chapter in Standing for Truth's book talking about how some primates have 2 bones in their lower limb and some do not, and that's what separates humans from the rest of the apes. The guy's incredible.
Being hit in the head, you get hit in the face, and that's why we started growing beards, and that's why chimpanzees do not have facial hair. Apparently, they don't like to punch each other in the face. So, and then, as you can see right below that, human beings, their hair, look at that, exactly the opposite in where hair actually grows. So we grow it in the exact opposite proportions than our closest kissing cousin relative. Like that makes any sense. So again, completely different hair and fur. And then if we go down just a little bit more, we can see a human have eyebrows. In our eyebrow hair. Primates of none of those have that at all. So like the subcutaneous layer of fat that runs underneath our skin that no primate has whatsoever.
Robert Sepper did this too. I guess these guys read, and by guys I mean pseudoscientists, they read less fat as just no fat. I'm going to play a clip from my Robert Sepper video now, because I already covered this.
Another uniquely human trait, when compared to primates, is that people have a layer of subcutaneous fat, which no other primate has, but is common in sea mammals, such as dolphins, whales, and seals.
So, this is incorrect. Humans are not the only primates with subcutaneous body fat. In fact, wild primates will usually have 9% or less, while humans range. Human women who are considered fit will tend to have 21 to 24% body fat, and men are going to have 14 to 17%. Thanks, breasts. Okay, so beards, head hair, eyebrows, and subcutaneous fat. Raw Matt was wrong on all of them, as usual. Raw Matt and Donnie spend a little bit of time going back and forth, talking about how strange it is that paleoanthropologists disagree on things within their field.
It's funny because even in their own lectures and dialogues that we spent a lot of time watching, in the Q&A period, people will ask, like, what evidence do we have for, XYZ? And these paleoanthropologists will admit, well, this is more of a hypothesis. At the current time, we don't really have any supporting evidence. This is just like a possible explanation. Maybe this is how we lost this. Maybe this is how we gained that.
Yes, that's how science works, but also, you know what they don't disagree on? That evolution happened. That Australopiths are bipedal. That we evolved in Africa. 100,000 million other things, all of which you guys reject. Raw Matt does another rambly minute or so speaking before saying that Sahelanthropus tchadensis is just a gorilla, which...
What they said about Sahelanthropus tchadensis for a very, very long time is, look, the foramen magnum is more near the middle. What they discover, it was nothing but a gorilla the entire time. Its foramen magnum, though, had shifted a little bit, probably because of the lifetime.
So I already made a video about this a year and a half ago, so there's no excuse for Raw Matt again. It was in December of 2020. But that being said, I couldn't find a soundbite that I really liked, so I'm just going to go over the topic of Sahelanthropus tchadensis really quick here, using the literature, something that is very foreign to Matt, given he likes to cite from like study.com and young Earth creationist sources. So, this paper is titled Nature and Relationships of Sahelanthropus tchadensis. It's by Macchiarelli et al., and I've gone over it before. Basically, there was some new postcranial material that came out of the site from Taurus Manala, and specifically it was a partial femur, and they analyzed a cross-section of the femoral shaft and determined that it was more similar to non-bipedal extant hominids. So this is what they said. The results of our preliminary functional analysis suggest TM266 femoral shaft belonged to an individual that was not habitually bipedal, something that should be taken into account when considering the relationships of Sahelanthropus tchadensis. The circumstances of its discovery should encourage researchers to check to see whether there is more postcranial evidence of Sahelanthropus tchadensis among the fossils recovered from Taurus Manala. So, very fascinating, very interesting. What has happened since then? Well, the guy who is basically the Sahelanthropus tchadensis guy, a French paleoanthropologist named Franck Guy, whom I called Guy in the first video, very faux pas, not cool of me, has a paper that's in the press. It's preprint, so if it's published, I believe it'll go into Nature Research, but I'm not entirely positive. And it says postcranial evidence of a late Miocene hominin bipedalism in Chad. There's two things you need to know about this. The first is that this is a preprint. It could totally change. It could be rejected. We don't know yet. It takes a year to 2 years to publish papers, so it's not out of the ordinary that it's not out yet. But that being said, it's not published. It hasn't been entirely peer-reviewed. The other thing that needs to be noted for this paper in its favor is that it's looking at the other postcranial material, because since Macchiarelli et al., Frank Guy has had the opportunity to examine 2 ulnae. So this is really important because for raw Matt, because I know he needs to be reminded of these things, in anatomical position, the forearm of humans and other apes is composed of 2 primary bones. That's the radius, that is more lateral or to the side, and then there is the ulna, that is more medial or towards the midline of the body. The ulna is important because its morphology can tell us about the potential for quadrupedalism or even knuckle walking in a primate. So this is obviously very cool, very interesting. And what they have to say here, what Guy et al. Have to say here, is these new findings confirm that hominins were already terrestrial bipeds relatively soon after the human-chimpanzee divergence, but also suggest that careful climbing arboreal behaviors were still a significant portion of their locomotor repertoire. So that's interesting to keep in mind. On the topic of the ulna, when we scroll down here, they basically note that there are portions of the ulna that reflect habitual arboreality, which is kind of expected. But that being said, they note it is unlikely to reflect habitual terrestrial quadrupedalism. The TM266 ulnae lack prominent flexor apparatus in theses, as in orangutans, Ardipithecus ramidus, and later hominins, Ardipithecus ramidus and later hominins. In this respect, it differs from the condition seen in Miocene apes and extant quadrupedal monkeys. Such morphology precludes the possibility of quadrupedalism, and more specifically, of knuckle walking as a primary locomotor behavior of the Taurus manala hominins. So, very interesting. What about the postcrania? On that, they have this to say. The Taurus manala femur exhibits several hallmarks of terrestrial bipedalism, habitual terrestrial bipedalism, so on the ground, walking upright. Among them, a well-defined, broad protolinea aspera, the presence of a lateral third trochanter and associated subtrochanteric platimaria without hypotrochanteric or inferolateral fossae is classically associated with enhanced hip flexion extension, while a particularly developed calcar femorale facilitates compressive loads, dispelling in terrestrial bipedalism. These features go with an overall cortical bone distribution pattern and cross-section geometries of the femoral shaft that suggest muscular recruitments and bone loads compatible with habitual bipedalism. So, they essentially come to the conclusion that this thing is a biped when it's on the ground and still climbing in the trees. So very similar to what we see in the later hominin, Ardipithecus ramidus, which is why, of course, they mention it. And it's interesting, too, because the habitat matches this. It's a woodland, a sort of sparse woodland. So they kind of conclude down here by noting, yet the Chadian postcranial material displays a suite of morphologic features that are consistent with substantial non-stereotypical arboreal behaviors, as suggested by ulnar curvature and cross-section geometric properties, whereas elbow morphology is potentially indicative of careful climbing and does not display evidence of knuckle walking. So this thing is not a knuckle walker and is probably a biped when on the ground. But again, this is still up for peer review, so we have to keep that in mind. Also, interestingly enough, I was at the AABAs this year, which is like the place that you go to make your case for new findings. And one of the guys was there who was making the case that Sahelanthropus tchadensis is a knuckle walker, not that it's actually a gorilla. And the entire conference was like, that's pretty tenuous. So, take that for what it's worth. We'll see if it makes it through peer review.
Spends most of its time sitting in an upright posture, which gorillas tend to do, then that can change. And it makes it appear as though, maybe it was walking around. And that misconception has led to huge amounts of storytelling. Remember, the first link of the chain was Sahelanthropus tchadensis for the very long time. Now, what do we know about it? They were completely wrong. Another failed prediction. All because of the single thing that they found, that foramen magnum adjustment.
I'm not quite sure Ramat actually understands the argument that Macchiarelli is making for Sahelanthropus not being a biped, given he's talking about the foramen magnum, and the entire paper makes a case based off of a cross-section of the femur. But that being said, I do want to talk a little bit about the foramen magnum, because if Ramat were correct and sitting around with an upright posture eating grass all day or leaves all day like gorillas tend to do, if this was truly the case that could have so much of an impact on the foramen magnum so as to make it look as anterior as a biped, we would just have gorillas that have anterior foramen magnums. We do not. So this is our stand-in for a gorilla, our chimpanzee skull, and as you can see, the foramen magnum is pretty intermediate, and it also angles backwards to help with this chimpanzee with its quadrupedal locomotion while simultaneously allowing for an orthograde or semi-upright posture. Here is Sahelanthropus tchadensis, right? When you're holding them at the same angle, Sahelanthropus tchadensis' foramen magnum is much more anterior or tucked underneath the skull. And this is to allow Sahelanthropus to hold its head upright like this, when it's walking along doing foraging in the Miocene. But I wanted to give Ramat a little something extra in hopes that maybe this time he will actually pay attention and learn something here, because I feel like he's just ignoring all of the previous critiques. As you know, A, but B, haha, A again. So I thought I'd pull out this paper titled Virtual Cranial Reconstruction of Sahelanthropus tchadensis. And I really like this paper. I only know about it because I read it in my hominin evolution class this past semester. And it's really cool. They go, we performed a generalized least square superimposition of the symmetrized landmark configurations of all specimens and calculated the minimum form change necessary to transform the TM266 reconstruction to the closest possible hypothetical pan and gorilla cranial forms with the use of the 99% probability density borders as a minimum distance criterion. Okay, so what did they do? They took the Sahelanthropus tchadensis skull, they stuck it into a scanner so that they could reconfigure it because the thing is pretty messed up. As you can see, it's been kind of exploded. And they thought, let's see if we can get it into a more pan and a more chimp-like form. And then let's see if we can do the same with gorillas. And the way they go, the isolated fragments of the allometric shape score, the isolated fragments of the TM266 cranium were then positioned to fit the calculated three-dimensional landmark configurations of the closest possible pan and gorilla shapes. The resulting pan-like and gorilla-like morphologies are anatomically infeasible. That is an important word there, involving overlap between neurocranial fragments and the disruption of anatomical continuity between neighboring facial fragments. Cannot have the same style of locomotion as a gorilla or as a chimpanzee. They continue and note that it's a robust estimate of the cranial form, and they think that it supports most of the details that were originally described, and basically say, yeah, it's probably a hominid. It's got most of the traits of hominids, or a hominin, most of the traits of a hominin, including things like the reduction of canine teeth, and of course that anterior or underneath foramen magnum. So then they start analyzing the foramen magnum and say, okay, like what does this look like? And they compare it to a bunch of different other hominids, and they go, the combined effect of the angular constraints is that the angle between the foramen magnum and the orbital plane is nearly perpendicular in Homo sapiens, but more acutely angled in Pan-troglodytes. So our spine comes right out the bottom, Pan-troglodytes or chimps, it comes out in the back at an angle, and other species with a more pronograde posture. The foramen magnum angle relative to the orbital plane in TM266's reconstruction is 95%, similar to that in humans and later bipedal hominids such as Australopithecus afarensis. They say as a quadruped, it would require unusually extended angles of the neck relative to the plane of the foramen magnum, which is what I've been saying the whole time. And then lastly, that they note as sort of an additional indication of bipedality, it has a flat nuchal plane oriented at about 36 degrees relative to the Frankfurt horizontal, well within the range of Australopithecus and Homo, but not Pan. In addition, the nuchal crest, so this is a crest that goes sort of along the back of the skull and anchors sort of chewing muscles back there, sometimes the temporalis, and things like that, has a downward lipping, a feature present in other bipedal hominids, but not in Pan or in gorilla. However, postcranial evidence will be necessary to test more rigorously the hypothesis that Sahelanthropus tchadensis is the earliest known hominid, they mean hominin, found 2,600 kilometers west of the East African Rift Valley, to find out if it was a biped.
And right there, look, that's the only part that they have of that until recently when they found the lower leg.
You see how much confidence they put?
I can't believe how much confidence Donnie puts in Ramat, given, well, everything. But in this particular case, the fact that he didn't know that there were two bones in the forearm of a human, the radius and the ulna, and that these bones are found in pretty much all tetrapods ontogenetically.
Every single paper that you read, there's just amazing finds. I guess they don't think young Earth creationists are listening or reading. Look at this.
My professors don't even know that young Earth creationists are still around.
From Australopithecus to Homo, the transition that wasn't. These are a couple excerpts from the paper, okay? Here's a couple links if you guys want to read the paper. William Kimball. Although the transition from Australopithecus to Homo is usually thought of as a momentous transformation, the fossil record bearing on the origin and earliest evolution of Homo is virtually undocumented.
Donnie, you weaselly little liar. I know for a fact you didn't read this paper, and if you did, that's significantly worse, because it means that you know exactly what you're obfuscating from the audience. Let's go through this together, because I've read this paper several times by Bill Kimball, who passed away this year, for my hominid evolution class, both for several different class periods for discussion, but also because I had to write a couple of different papers on it. So let's read it together. Standing for Truth minds the first sentence of the abstract, as he tends to do. Although the transition from Australopithecus to Homo is usually thought of as a momentous transformation, the fossil record bearing on the origin and earliest evolution of Homo is virtually undocumented. As a result, the poles of the transition are frequently attached to the taxa Australopithecus afarensis versus Homo habilis or Homo erectus. So that's where you're saying it's the end of Australopithecus or the beginning of Homo. So if you go down, you get this little gem. There is a pattern inferred for species usually included as early Homo, including Homo erectus, which has often been cast in the role of the earliest human-like hominin. A fresh look at brain size, hand morphology, and earliest technology suggests that a number of key Homo attributes may already be present in generalized species of Australopithecus, and that adaptive distinctions in Homo are simply amplifications or extensions of ancient hominin trends. So what they're saying is, Australopiths and early Homo, it's a smooth gradient. It's a transition, but it gets worse than that, because if you scroll on down to the conclusion section, you get Standing for Truth's second quote mine from this paper. The fossil record bearing on the ancestry of Pleistocene Homo is poor. Oh, okay. What does the next sentence say? However, the more we learn about early Homo, the less compelling is the case that an adaptive shift can be read from currently documented skull and skeletal anatomy as a major transition from generalized Australopithecus precursors. Early phylogenetically basal species of the Homo clade resemble generalized Australopiths more than they do later species of the clade, as expected from a Darwinian pattern of descent with modification. These and subsequent transitional species of the Homo lineage, e.g. Homo erectus, erode the impression of distinct adaptive suites created by comparisons between terminal taxa or those separated by large temporal gaps. The epigraph heading this paper indicates that Darwin himself recognized this as a probable outcome of descent with modification given a grown fossil record. And then he continues to go on and say, whether or not we choose to adopt the large number of super-specific taxonomic ranks and their associated taxon names dictated by a bushy hominin clade is not a pressing scientific matter in the quest to understand human origins. Of greater importance can be counted recent arguments for the use or manufacture of stone tools in time periods predating some 500,000 years of the earliest Homo known so far, and the potential they have to shrink the adaptive space between Homo and Australopithecus still further. Indeed, the expanded brain size, human-like wrist and hand anatomy, dietary eclecticism, and potential tool-making capabilities of generalized Australopiths root the Homo lineage in ancient hominid adaptive trends, suggesting that the transition from Australopithecus to Homo may not have been much of a transition at all. So the paper that Standing cites to muddy the waters is actually just saying we have too many hominins, we don't know what to do with them, the transition is too smooth. He is a liar. He's either lying that he read the paper, or he's lying about the paper. There is no alternative explanation, unless he literally doesn't understand it, in which case I feel really bad for him.
The fossil record bearing on the ancestry of Pleistocene Homo, notice this, is poor. Is poor.
His representation of the second paper there on the screen is not better. This paper is titled The Pliocene Hominin Diversity Conundrum, Do More Fossils Mean Less Clarity? And it is basically the same thing as the previous one. It talks about how we essentially have too many hominins to know what to do with. It's becoming more of a bush instead of a tree, right? Dr. Johannes Haile Selassie, I met him actually at the AABAs this year. He's a lovely guy, and he's the discoverer of Australopithecus diarmida. Very interesting. Some people think it should be subsumed in Australopithecus afarensis, but we'll see. So what we see here at the end is this: although there is no doubt that the presence of multiple species during the Middle Pliocene opens new windows into our evolutionary past, it also complicates our understanding of early hominid taxonomy and phylogenetic relationships. So basically the point is that we have too many. We have too many Australopiths. And this is something that Donnie simply does not care about. He will just evidently lie to you about reading these papers.
Notice this, Bernard Wood. 50 years after Homo habilis, even with all the fossil evidence and analytical techniques from the past 50 years, a convincing hypothesis for the origin of Homo remains elusive.
So, it is in the first paragraph of the abstract again. I'm growing more and more convinced they don't read past what they perceive to be the abstract, which is not great. In the middle of all this, Standing takes the opportunity to start yelling at Joel Duff in the side chat, and should probably switch to wine.
We had Dr. Joel Duff in the chat who's terrified to take the evolution challenge, and who has, he's up there. as a potential winner of the 2022 Golden Dodgeball Award because he dodges, he ducks, he dips, he dives, he dodges all over the place. He's mastered the 5 Ds of dodgeball. I mean, Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson, you know, he's got confirmed testable predictions, and you know, evolutionism has been overturned. And poor Dr. Duff here, he's not really refuting the data. He's not countering it. I haven't seen any worthy argument. So he was pointing out earlier, oh, you know, when you've got an AIG source, you know, scoffing at that. It's like, we've got answers in Genesis sources, we've got dozens of secular sources, we've got a mix of everything. Okay, try and refute it all. And that's fallacious anyways. I mean, ridiculous.
Next, Donnie is going to get a little wacky with regard to the Y chromosomal disparity between humans and chimpanzees. As we all know, humans and chimps are 98.8% similar with regard to coding base pairs and about 96% similar when we're doing a whole genome comparison. But this number is actually a lot lower when we're looking at the Y chromosomes, which means technically I'm more closely related to a chimp than my husband is. In fact, while the human Y chromosome is still most similar to a chimpanzee Y chromosome and vice versa with regard to the sequence identity, in structure, the human Y chromosome is more similar to that of the gorilla Y chromosome. So when you're comparing all three, the chimpanzee actually ends up being the odd man out. Now, I've covered what I just said in a previous video, 2 previous videos actually, and this disparity is probably due to a few things, but namely it's going to be sperm competition.
While Oetjens et al. Confirmed that the Y chromosome of humans is highly divergent from that of chimps, they also found that the chimp subspecies Y chromosomes are highly divergent from each other. In fact, compared to humans and the draft Y chromosome of gorillas, it seems that the Y chromosome of genus Pan is rapidly undergoing mutation.
You may be wondering, okay, but why?
Chimpanzees and bonobos are both highly polygamous species. Males and females mate with one another frequently, very frequently in bonobos, and as such there is a heavy selection for competitive sperm. This is reflected in the rather large testes size of this genera when compared to the other great apes. A large portion of the human population is prone to single or serial pair bonding, and gorillas are polygynous, meaning little sperm competition is required.
So as it turns out, the hypothesis was correct. The chimpanzee Y chromosome, and that of the bonobo to a lesser extent, is seemingly the derived version here, leaving that of the gorilla, the orang, and the human just in the dust.
On the face of it, one may conclude that this violates the well-supported notion that humans are more closely related to chimpanzees and bonobos than any other animal. Standing did in fact conclude this, but for someone who talks a lot about genetics, he doesn't seem to grasp a very important distinction, one that was covered in the very paper he brought up, that in sequence identity, humans are still most closely related to genus Pan in the Y chromosome.
This may seem inconsequential, but I had the opportunity to discuss this topic with CRISPR prior to recording, and it may shock you to know that sequence identity is indeed more informative to relatedness than structure is. I know. Shocking.
Imagine it like this. You have your favorite movie. Let's just go ahead and use the first Harry Potter movie. You own the original copy of the VHS release as well as 2 other copies, one being the same as the original but with the last 3 scenes suspiciously missing, cut out, if you will, from the tape. And the last copy would be Harry Potter but with guns, as in every scene that could potentially use wands is replaced with using guns. The original film and the cut film are virtually identical in content, that is to say, sequence identity. The only difference is that the second copy is shorter. It has chunks missing at the end. When both of them are compared to the last copy, the first, the original, and the last copy are structurally very similar. That is to say, they're the same length. But the content, that is, the sequence identity, are incredibly different.
So the human Y chromosome is more structurally similar to the gorilla Y chromosome, and they are roughly the same size. But when we're looking at the sequence identity, the human Y chromosome has much more in common with the Pan Y chromosome than with the gorilla Y chromosome. Bad audio, worse camera. But I think that was a decent summary of what's going on here. Let's hear from Donnie.
Sperm competition as one of the reasons why, when you consider overall gene content, architecture.
Yeah, that was an okay summary. Let's see if he explores any of it.
Okay, the Y chromosome between the humans and chimpanzees is only about 35% the same.
Wait, what was that?
Only about 35% the same.
So here's the paper that he's citing from. This is Hughes et al. And if you scroll down, it's from 2010, to the 6th page near the bottom, you get the actual comparison, right? Surprisingly, however, greater than 30% of the chimpanzee MSY sequence has no homologous alignable counterpart in the human MSY and vice versa. So I saw this and I was like, am I losing my mind? Like, wouldn't that still just be a 30% difference? And then I just kind of Googled it, and it turns out creation.com is on my side, and Standing for Truth just has absolutely no idea what he's talking about. He's just completely forgotten the number, I guess, or like I don't know where he's gotten it. But even creation.com says the 30% difference among the human and chimp MSY regions was a shock. And you can also find this on like a randomscience.com website. More than 30% of the DNA differs between humans and chimps in the region of the Y chromosome that determines sex. So, of course, the overall point here is that Standing for Truth doesn't even know his own number. So I'm sure the rest of this will go very well.
And it turns out that the human Y chromosome is more similar to the gorilla Y chromosome when you consider overall gene content, architecture, and size differences than it is to the chimpanzee. So she tried to say, oh, the odd man out is the chimpanzee, and gave the same hypotheses that are given by evolutionists who have studied this. For example, a variety of these hypotheses have been presented even in this paper here, the original paper. Chimpanzee and human Y chromosomes are remarkably divergent in structure and gene content.
I didn't try to say anything. That is demonstrably the case. In any paper that covers chimpanzees, humans, and gorilla Y chromosomes, humans and gorillas lump to one side, and chimpanzees have this highly divergent Y. This is just what the literature says, so take it up with them. I see why he has to take issue with that, though, because under his worldview, using the Y chromosome would mean that humans and gorillas are a kind, and then chimps are their own kind, panins. So that wouldn't be great for them.
The point is, okay, the Y chromosome should have been the most stable between humans and chimpanzees. It should have been very similar.
No, it shouldn't. The Y chromosome does not need to undergo consistent recombination in order to have a dynamic means by which to acquire new genes. We'll talk about this more in a second with some papers, but let's let Standing, Donnie, finish his piece here.
Again, it's only about 35% similar, 35% similar, 35% similar.
That's kind of embarrassing, isn't it?
Okay, so she can look to sperm competition. She can say the chimpanzee's the odd man out. She can look to polygamous relationships and activity in chimpanzee groups, but without predictions. Okay, if it's just a story, it's pseudoscience. Okay, we did a whole 2-hour video on it that she dodged, but I'm just going to go over this slide. Okay, before we move on, and people can check out that video in its entirety. Notice this. What are the implications of this new information? First, for the evolutionist, the Y chromosomes must be evolving much more quickly than anyone imagined previously. Now, anytime you see rapid evolution or engines of evolution, you'll see that when we get into a lot of the genetics papers that we have here later. That's just Evo speak for very different, right? Why is it very different? Well, it must have evolved rapidly. Because remember, they don't question the bigger picture. Assume evolution to prove evolution. They are now going to have to, okay, so Erica, okay, you are going to have to apply mathematical models to try to demonstrate how. You can't just say, oh, sperm competition, or you can't just show, levels of diversity within, various chimpanzee groups, which is still nothing compared to the human and chimpanzee Y chromosome, which is 35% similar.
It hurts. I'm hurting for you, Donnie. I'm hurting for you here. Just kidding, ding dong. Should have double checked the numbers.
That's very, 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 very different. Okay, especially considering every single male human Y chromosome, 99.999% similar. And we know that the mutation rate in the Y chromosome, human male Y chromosome, is about 3 mutations now per generation, now that we've looked at high sequencing data. Okay, so we have a mutation rate that's incredibly fast in the Y chromosome, and yet low DNA variation. That means the Y chromosome has to be young. That's the only way to explain a DNA compartment that has a fast mutation rate and low variation. The Y chromosome can then not go back hundreds of thousands to millions of years, or else there would be a higher level of genetic variation. This is very easy to understand. Dr. Joel Duff, let's go. This is right from the secular literature. Come on.
He's just trying to fight Joel Duff in the chat again. Nobody cares. But that being said, I want to talk about this Y chromosome here for a minute, right? Because Standing for Truth, he wants the predictions, right? He wants the numbers to support sperm competition as this active driver for a fast mutating Y chromosome in the Pannin lineage. And because this man is the king of gish galloping, he also wants an answer as to why the human Y chromosomal mutation rate is so high, but the diversity is so low. So we'll just answer them both. Can we provide that for him? Of course we can. So human Y chromosome first. How do we have such low diversity with such a high mutation rate? Shouldn't the diversity be higher or the mutation rate slower? The mutation rate actually is significantly slower. That high coverage study, he's using this pedigree rate that he obtained from Nathaniel Jeanson's book, Replacing Darwin, and it is inappropriate to apply back into time. He knows this, he's been corrected on it by Dan, and admitted that he is wrong.
You are correct in that the observed pedigree rate, the empirical rate, is faster than the long-term rate, the substitution rate, because selection will weed out a lot of these new mutations. Most new variants are lost over time, of course.
I really love Dan's face here, where he's just like, yes, he's finally getting it. Finally. Give it one day, Dan. He forgets it. This is a 2020 paper by Kachova et al. Titled Dynamic Evolution of Great Ape Y Chromosomes. Right off the bat, we see that sperm production is on the front lines. We're going to mosey on down to the abstract here. The Y chromosome of great apes represent a particular puzzle. Their gene content is more similar between humans and gorillas than between humans and chimpanzees, even though humans and chimpanzees share a more recent common ancestor. To solve this puzzle, here we constructed a dataset including the Ys of all extant great ape genera. We generated assemblies of bonobo and orangutan Ys from short and long sequencing reads and aligned them with publicly available human, chimp, and gorilla Y assemblies. Analyzing this dataset, we found that the genus Pan, which includes chimps and bonobos, experienced accelerated substitution rates. Pan also exhibited elevated gene death rates. Perhaps this has something to do with the fact that the chimpanzee Y is smaller than any of the other great apes. These observations are consistent with high levels of sperm competition in Pan. So hold on, stop right there. They went in with a prediction that their data, their reads, would be copacetic with the sperm competition hypothesis, and lo and behold, it was. But we're going to get into that a little bit more in a second. Furthermore, we inferred that the great ape common ancestor already possessed multi-copy sequences homologous to most human and chimpanzee palindromes. Nonetheless, each species also acquired distinct ampliconic sequences. We also detected increased chromatin contact between and within palindromes, likely facilitating gene conversion and structural rearrangements. Our results highlight the dynamic mode of Y chromosome evolution and opens avenues for the studies of male-specific dispersal in endangered great apes. So they produced a couple of draft assemblies for the bonobo and Sumatran orangutan Ys, which we didn't already have, did their assemblies, determined which scaffolds were ampliconic and which were X-degenerate, and then they did their alignments, and they say that they were confirmed like previous results. For example, as was shown previously, the gorilla Y had the highest percentage of its sequence aligning to the human Y, 75.5 and 89.6 for multi-species and pairwise alignments respectively. In terms of sequence identity, the chimp and bonobo Ys were most similar to each other, 99.1 to 99.2 and even 98% for multi-species and pairwise alignments respectively, while the orangutan Y had the lowest identity to any other great ape Y chromosome. Looks like that ape kinda might be humans, bonobos, chimps, and gorillas, and we're booting the orangs. And for multi-species alignments, the human Y was most similar in sequence to the chimpanzee or bonobo Ys at 97.9 and 97.8% respectively, less similar to the gorilla, 97.2, and least similar to the orangutan, 93.6. And this is, of course, in the sequence, which is, of course, as they know here, in agreement with the accepted phylogeny of the species. The pairwise alignments confirm this trend. So they're basically trying to figure out the issue with the structure. So now they talk about the substitution rates on the Y. They're trying to figure out the substitution rates among the great apes and sort of how they differ. So they say, we next asked whether the chimpanzee Y chromosome, the architecture and gene content of which differ drastically from the human and gorilla, experience an elevated substitution rate. Using our multi-species Y chromosomal alignment, we estimated substitution rates along the branches of the great ape phylogenetic tree. Now, standing for truth, Donnie might say, aha, but you can't use the phylogenetic tree. That has evolutionary assumptions. Well, my friend, we're trying to find out if we can make the Y chromosome for the chimpanzees, for the panids, work within an evolutionary context. So this is appropriate both in legitimate science and for the game that we're currently playing now. And remember, you did agree that this was the appropriate course of action.
You are correct in that the observed pedigree rate, the empirical rate, is faster than the long-term rate, the substitution rate, because selection will weed out a lot of these new mutations. Most new variants are lost over time, of course.
So in the results section, additionally, they note that while the Pan lineage experienced an elevated substitution rate at both autosomes and the Y, the elevation was particularly strong on the Y. In our gene death conversation, they note, to summarize, the pan genus experienced the highest death rates for both X-degenerate and ampliconic genes across the great apes. Additionally, we observed a significantly higher non-synonymous to synonymous rate ratios for the 4 X-degenerate genes and 1 ampliconic gene in bonobos, chimpanzees, and or their common ancestor. They continue down to our discussion, because I'm going to skip palindromes and stuff like that. I'm not nearly as well read on them. And I like to try not to talk about things that I don't, feel well read on. So the discussion on the higher substitution rates. They say higher substitution rates on the Y than on the autosomes, which we found across the great ape phylogeny, confirm another study. This is 28 right here. Strong male-driven evolution of DNA sequences in humans and apes. Oops, that's our Donnie. That's our Donnie Deals thing. And they note higher autosomal substitution rates than we detected in pan as opposed to Homo lineage, corroborate yet another study, that's this one, number 29, and can be explained by a shorter generation time in pan. A higher Y to autosomal substitution ratio, stronger male mutation bias in pan rather than Homo, is observed bias here and could be due to several reasons. So they note, boy, first species with sperm competition produce more sperm and thus undergo a different number of replication rounds, generating more mutations on the Y and potentially leading to stronger male mutation bias than species without sperm competition. Consistent with this expectation, chimpanzees and bonobos experience sperm competition and exhibit strong male mutation bias as compared with no sperm competition and weak male mutation biases in the human and gorilla. So, boy, that matches with the data. That's really strange, isn't it? But remember when I was talking about getting new genes? That was your foreshadowing for this right here. We discovered that there is only one gene family that was born across the entire great ape Y phylogeny. VCY was acquired by the common ancestors of the human and chimpanzee. So that's very, very interesting, isn't it? Looks like those kinds are having a real struggle bus today, aren't they? So there you have it, Donnie. A deeper dive into how sperm competition can lead to the evolution of the Y chromosome in panins by way of male mutation bias, and how that was stacked against the great ape phylogeny, the phylogenetic rate, which you do accept, as we know. And if you want to see that phylogenetic rate stacked up against, mutations and spermatogenesis and all that stuff, that can be found in the paper and in the supplementary material, whose link you can find in the description. I can't hold your hand the whole way. So as I'm scrolling through the supplementary material here, the math, as it were, I want you to appreciate that we did just experience a Donnie Deals fallacy. There is a fact that humans and chimpanzees, the panins, share 98.8% of their DNA, and so as a response to this, Donnie and company invoke the disparate Y chromosome. This is idea A. So I respond with counter B. Yes, they are disparate, but we have a mechanism, along with testable predictions that came to fruition, that explains this disparity. And they respond with, but have you considered the disparate Y chromosome? A is simply reasserted a second time. You have to actually deal with the criticisms to your premise. That's part of a dialogue, right? And when, standing for truth, Donnie, come up with a reason, a mathematical reason, they challenge the math presented here, and they solve the reason as to why sperm competition can't actually work as a viable mechanism. They can direct that criticism to PNAS. Donnie picks yet another fight with Joel Duff in the side chat.
Dr. Joel Duff, Mr. Dodgeball Man himself, says, take some classes and learn a few things. I have a whole, so notice, 0 arguments, 0 counter responses. This is why Joel dodges the evolution debate challenge. Come on. We've had and hosted over 160 debates. What are you waiting for?
160 debates, you say? Well, let me just get on the phone right now with Nature and PNAS and Science, ASAP. They do say that science moves forward one YouTube video at a time, especially when they're debates and when the people who are involved are convicted domestic abusers, ex-used car salesmen and nurses, and random guys who believe that, you can live to 100 if you just don't eat anything.
1,000 Genomes Project. Okay, this unrooted mitochondrial DNA phylogenetic tree. Any evolutionists in the chat? Come on. Do what Erica and Dodgeball Danster and Cardinal have not been able to do. All right, there's only a few mutations here separating any two people. The mutation rate, okay, is about one per generation, or one every other generation. Let's give them that. It's a fast mutation rate, put it that way. Yet low variation, about 100 to 120 max between any two people. But on average, what is it, Matt? About 20 to 24, 25. So we got explosive growth from a center point, exactly what we would expect from the biblical model of ancestry, right? What do we have? Creation, Adam and Eve, followed by rapid and exponential population growth. Then we have a couple thousand years later, the flood, 8 people, rapid and exponential population growth. We have some of these subgroups that can be explained by the Babel dispersal. Okay, so guess what? All these branches going back to a center point.
As previously mentioned, this unrooted tree is utilized in young Earth creationist Nathaniel Jeanson's book, Replacing Darwin. Jeanson makes the argument that the nodes indicated by the arrows on this tree indicate the wives of Noah's son, Noah from Noah's Ark, and thus that the 1,000 Genomes Project actually supports young Earth creationism. The problem with this has been levied against Nathaniel Jeanson, first by Evograd, but many times since then. The problem is, when you take the unrooted tree and root it, it turns out that the wives of 2 of Noah's sons are separated from the wife of the 3rd remaining son by 400 to 1,500 years. Jeanson's reasoning actually indicates that 2 of Noah's sons were married to the great-great-great 2 to 94 times more great-great-granddaughters of the wife of Noah's remaining son. Now, Donnie's gonna get mad. He's gonna say, she's using old stuff from Evograd. We've answered these questions. Jeanson has answered these questions. And Jeanson has actually answered the question. He did so in a conversation he had with Dan recently. You wanna hear the answer?
It's not gonna be 3 coexisting individuals.
Right.
It's again, it's a small point that's not related to the Neanderthal thing, but it is relevant.
No, I agree with it. And that's my point, is that there could have been some wonky things pre-flood that I discuss in the literature.
Okay. So, okay.
You know, wonky things. He's just invoking some mysterious mechanism, some mysterious processes. What are the processes? I mean, you know, they're wonky processes. I don't know what they are, but they're wonky. And that is not science. That's embarrassing. So lastly, we're going to talk about that fast mutation rate that Standing for Truth says supports young Earth creationism. He's again getting that fast mutation rate from the work of Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson. Now, Nathaniel Jeanson, his work is problematic with this mutation rate, right? Because what he actually does is he takes the mutation rate, or the rate at which mutations happen in the genome, and he uses that instead of the substitution rate, which is the rate at which mutations fixate within a population. You can't do that. This is population genetics 101. Now you might be thinking, well, Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson got his PhD from Harvard. He would never, ever make such a boneheaded mistake. But he did.
Let me again derive how I'm getting to this point. So we've got my claim from the examination of the published literature that the mutation rate is 3 mutations per generation, and I'm treating the mutation rate as a substitution rate, that this rate is consistent.
Thank you. Thank you.
That's what I'm doing.
This methodological bait and switch is the linchpin of Jeanson's work, and more broadly, all the young Earth attempts to fit the breadth of human genetic variation into a young Earth timeline. Openly admitting the move ends the debate over whether these calculations, and by extension the young Earth timeframes for genetic divergence in Homo sapiens, are valid.
That was a clip from Dan's conversation with Jeanson, so please go support his channel, subscribe. We wouldn't have that clip if it weren't for him. But yeah, that's the ball game. You cannot conflate those two things, and Nathaniel Jeanson just did. Donnie, to my knowledge, has been relatively quiet on this, so I'm eager to see his response if he ever does touch it. With the invalidation of the body of work of one of the biggest young Earth creationist advocates of all time out of the way, let's move on.
ERVs, mitochondrial DNA phylogenetics, and Y chromosome dissimilarity. Any evolutionists in the chat? Joel, go ahead. There's 3 you can deal with. Let's get some empirical levels. Go.
We've covered 2 of those already, but not ERVs. I think he goes into it a little bit more later. We'll see. If not, we'll cover it at the end. In a painfully predictable move, Ramat then goes down his list of things that are different between humans and chimpanzees. And I've already gone through it all in another video. It's like verbatim the same list. So I'm going to play that video as answers to all of this, periodically coming in if there's something I want to add. Let me correct myself real quick. It's not verbatim the same list because Romat actually gets new things wrong in this new list. So for those, also important to remember is the fact that there are traits that make humans unique when compared to chimpanzees. Otherwise, we would just be chimpanzees. Chimpanzees also have traits that make them unique when compared to humans or gorillas or any of the other apes. But as I said previously, remember that the things that are indeed uniquely human, these things are going to create a very nice prediction that evolutionary theory can make. If there's a trait that is unique to humans, this trait, if it is something skeletal, should be trackable in the fossil record, right? We should see this slow gradient, this slow change over time from proposed common ancestors all the way to anatomically modern humans. That's the prediction that evolution makes.
Okay, so the first thing that she brought up was that we have the same number of teeth, and that is true, but they are different types of teeth as well.
No, Romat, the teeth are the same. Chimpanzees have 4 types of teeth: incisors, canines, premolars, and molars, and the same dental formula, 2-1-2-3 over 2-1-2-3, which is the Catarrhine dental formula. There is a single difference, and it's the number of cusps on the premolar, the first premolar.
The maxilla and mandibles are shaped very differently. We have 2, chimps have 1, so that's interesting.
This part is actually just gibberish. So the maxilla houses the upper dentition, and it is a single bone in chimps, just as it is a single bone in Homo sapiens. And the mandible is a single bone that is the jaw, and it houses the lower dentition. It has different parts to it, but it's a single bone, same as in humans or Homo sapiens. In fact, a fused mandibular synthesis is actually one of the traits that unites all anthropoids, of which humans, chimps, and numerous other different types of primates are a part.
We have the parabolic jaw shape that primates do not have. That shape is very, very unique, and it's just in people.
Only humans have a parabolic palate. True, but the change from rectangular palate that we see in the proposed last common ancestors for humans and chimpanzees to the parabolic palate seen in anatomically modern humans, this slow gradient is documented in the fossil record.
Another one, she said we have the exact same rods and cones.
We do.
So we could actually share the exact same number, but what really matters is where those rods and cones are inside the eye.
Yeah, they're both in the retina, in humans and in chimps, and in most other mammals.
She said our brains are essentially the same at 6 minutes 55 seconds. That was pretty funny. Methylation different, orphan gene different.
Let me say that one more time for you. Not in primates whatsoever. Not in primates whatsoever. This is from a paper titled Origins of De Novo Genes in Humans and Chimpanzees, and in the introduction, second paragraph, we discuss orphan genes. Species or lineage-specific genes, which are often called orphan genes, have been described in a wide range of organisms, including yeast, primates, rodents, insects, and plants. So I don't know where he's going here. I guess he's talking about orphan genes being highly expressed in the human brain, but not in primates, except even though they are in all of these organisms, they are also highly expressed in chimpanzee brains. Hence the subject of this paper. Orphan genes, we covered it. Chimps and humans both have their own orphan genes. So does every other animal, because an orphan gene is effectively a lineage-specific gene. Humans don't typically have any more than anybody else does, so. This means that if he wants to use orphan genes to separate humans from chimpanzees, it also separates chimps from gorillas and gorillas from orangutans and every species from every other species, which means species is what a kind is, and they can't fit all those guys on Noah's Ark anymore. But to make matters worse, orphan genes also work in a nested hierarchy, which means humans and chimps share orphan genes that gorillas lack, and gorillas, humans, and chimps share orphan genes that orangutans lack, etc., etc. And in this paper, which I mentioned in that video that I just cited, this paper actually did a comprehensive review, and it resulted in the identification of over 5,000 new multi-exonic transcriptional events in the human and/or chimpanzee that are not observed in the rest of the species. Using comparative genomics, we show the expression of these transcripts is associated with the gains of regulatory motifs upstream of the transcription start site and downstream of the TSS. In general, these transcripts show little evidence of purifying selection, suggesting many of them are not functional. However, we find signatures of selection in a subset of de novo genes, which have the evidence of protein translation. Taken together, the data support a model in which frequently occurring new transcriptional events in the whole genome provide the raw material for the evolution of new proteins.
Gray matter different. We actually have rose hip neurons that are only found in human beings.
Humans have rose hip neurons in the brain. No apes have this. So rosehip neurons, I believe, are actually pretty recent work. I have them up here. So I googled, do chimps have rosehip neurons? It is still possible that these newly identified neurons will also be found in the brains of primates like monkeys or chimps, Lyon says. And the reason is because in the original study, they were comparing it to mice. So we know mice don't have rosehip neurons. But you know what else mice don't have? Any of these traits that we went over at the beginning, which is why they aren't primates, why they aren't haplorhines, why they aren't simiiforms or anthropoids, why they aren't catarrhines, why they aren't hominoids, and why they aren't hominids. So he's kind of just making shit up here, right? Saying that they don't have rosehip neurons, okay, it hasn't actually been investigated to my knowledge.
I mean, we have speech modules in the brain. Everything about the brain is different. So what do you mean the same? That's a ridiculous comment to make.
Like the parabolic palate, we can see language centers emerging based off of endocasts of extinct hominins from the Australopiths upward. But language is specifically a word that we use for human communication, and other primates have their own complicated forms of relaying meaning to one another. For example, this is something I bring up all the time. Campbell's monkeys concatenate vocalizations into context-specific call sequences. So Campbell's monkeys have syntax, a type of grammar. Geladas, which are a type of Old World monkey, they have vocal sequences that follow Menzerat's and Zipf's linguistic laws, which is the basis of human language. The gestural repertoire of chimps, of course, is very interesting because it seems innate to hominids. It matches that of the 1 to 2 year old human child at about a rate of 90% down here. So different distinct gestures, we share 90% of them as young kids, about 90% with chimpanzees. And then of course there's the most recent paper on this from May 16th, 2022, titled Chimpanzees Produce Diverse Vocal Sequences with Ordered and Recombinational Properties. This was fascinating because what they did was they focused on the structure of vocal sequences, analyzed 4,828 recordings of 48 wild adult chimps from the Thai National Forest, and they produced 390 unique vocal sequences. The vocal units emitted singly were also emitted in 2-unit sequences, so they can combine them in turn, and then they can combine them into 3-unit sequences. From a purely structural perspective, the capacity to organize single units into structured sequences offers a versatile system potentially suitable for expansive meaning generation. So they're doing sentences, basically.
She said, we have all the same bones. Well, that's wrong as well, because we have the nose bone alone. Right there is instantly proves it wrong. We also have fewer ribs, but more vertebrae. It's totally opposite in chimpanzees.
This one's easy. So humans and orangutans both have 1 fewer thoracic vertebra than chimpanzees and gorillas do because we both lost it. That's a convergent evolution thing, potentially related to upright or orthograde posture. How do we know that we lost it? Because Australopiths have the human formula, not the ancestral one that chimpanzees and gorillas maintain. So this is another thing that's like, yeah, it's different, but the transition is recorded in the fossil record.
Chimpanzees have also 31 bones in their feet, but human feet make up 26, 52 in total. So again, completely different number.
So this one I know he just Googled, but it turns out if you actually go into the paper that says chimpanzees have 31 bones in the foot, it actually has a foot model. And this model, for the sake of biomechanics, includes the distal long bones of the leg, so the tibia and the fibula, and it also considers several of the sesamoids, these little pea-sized bones that are around the joint areas of the big toe. So it considers some of them unfused. So no, that's not right, Ramat.
Did you know when their spine breaks, they can heal it? When our spine breaks, we're done. We're done.
Primate spine can repair itself. I have no idea. Again, I told you I was going to mention this later. We're putting a G there because I don't know what that means. And when I looked into it, I couldn't find a lot. And since he didn't source it, I can't actually investigate the claim itself. So
our ribs can regrow. Theirs can't. They have no rib regeneration. Kind of odd that God said he used our rib to make Eve and our ribs can actually regrow. Kind of what are the odds that ancient sheep herders knew that one, huh?
The paper that he uses to support this actually makes the case that mammals can regenerate portions of the rib if it is in direct contact with the perichondrium. So that would include other apes.
The foot structure is very different. It's not found in chimpanzees, the 3-arch system that's found in the human being foot.
Yep, chimpanzees don't have any arches in their foot, and humans have 3. You know who also has 3? Australopithecus, the genus. And you know who has slightly fewer than 3? Ardipithecus, the immediate predecessor. So it seems like we're seeing the emergence of the arches in the fossil record. Shocker.
They have a bacillum, or the bone in the penis. human beings don't have that. Ours is an organ, an actual organ. So I don't know how we lost an actual bone and then evolved an organ.
Let the record show Ramat doesn't know what a baculum is or what it does. It's actually a bone found in the penis, inside the organ that all male mammals have, or nearly all male mammals have. So the penis is the organ, the baculum is the bone within the organ. We didn't have to re-evolve a penis, Ramat. It's a bone found within it to help aid in rigidity during copulation. And in chimpanzees and in gorillas, the baculum size is about as large as my thumbnail. So it is almost entirely vestigial. And if memory serves, sometimes modern chimpanzees can be born without a baculum. So perhaps it's on its way out. The baculum is also lacking in some monogamous New World monkeys. This potentially suggests that there's convergent evolution going on here by way of social system.
Only humans have a hyoid bone in the throat region that's for speech. The primates don't have that, so that's another big difference right there.
Other primates have hyoid bones, and they use them for some vocalizations, which means we've just taken an already existing relationship and amped it up to 11. Try again.
We have a single ligament attached to the ring-shaped in the tibia. What else do we got?
I don't know which ligament he's talking about here, which attachment site. It would be helpful if you were a bit more specific. But what I do know is that it's probably quite similar to the Protolinea aspera, which can be found in australopiths, but not chimpanzees.
How about the bones themselves? Our very bones are different. The chimps have bones that are densely packed with microfiber structures that are strong. And
Modern humans have lower bone density than chimpanzees and Japanese macaques, but humans that lived 300,000 years ago did not. We know because we have their bones. This is likely a result of a lack of natural selection maintaining these high bone densities because we're living a less rough and tumble lifestyle.
Man, great stuff. Great stuff. So, you know what, Erica? And I understand why she's failing so bad. I mean, think about those that help her. Diaper Dino. You know, I mean, that guy's pretty worthless. Dodgeball Dan, the one-trick pony.
Civil, respectful, and sophisticated.
I'm going to destroy this nonsense here on the genetic similarities. It'll be dodged.
Standing for Truth talks briefly about how there's splicing differences in the tissues of different primates. Yes, please deal with the 98.8% that is shared.
The first such research in 2007 showed that alternative splicing differs significantly. Notice this, and I showed the paper earlier. Differs significantly between humans and chimps.
Yes, chimpanzees and humans differ in 1.2% of their coding DNA. We also differ in our ratios of fast to slow twitch muscle fibers. Why is this a surprise?
Okay, and this whole 98 to 99% genetic similarity, listen, it doesn't really, whether it's 98% or 88%, okay, there has to be a form of life that we as humans are most similar to. When God created humans, and then the rest of the biological world, by definition, we had to be more similar to something.
At least he's finally backing away from the toxic cesspool that is Jeffrey Tompkins' numbers. I was raring and ready to pull that clip out.
And it turned out, wow, we're more similar to the chimpanzee than the fish. Okay, but you know what? It's not 98%. It's lower than that. Okay, when you actually consider overall gene content, architecture, size differences, gaps, copy number variations, all right? When you consider it all, it's less than 98%.
Yes, 96%.
But at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. Yeah, we're most similar to the chimpanzee.
Notice how he doesn't say it? He doesn't say 96%. He's, what are you doing? You scared there, Donnie? Donnie harps on epigenetics for a minute, just skimming over the fact that it is the easily heritable DNA that is actually what we use in comparative genomics, both to link organisms within a species and to link species together. And creationists do this too. It's how they're able to create their canid kind. But again, it just stops arbitrarily at some point. Then he talks about how the 3D genome is unique for every species.
And the last thing I want to cover, this is newer. The 3D genome is vastly different. Answer this one. Quit dodging. All plant and animal genomes studied so far exhibit complex and distinct three-dimensional structures in their chromosome configurations depending on the type of cell.
Again, I don't know how this helps you. Like, you're using it to distinguish between humans and chimps, but the hard part of all this is you have to find a way as a young Earth creationist to separate humans and chimps, but lump the rest of the great apes, or lump all the canids together. And humans and chimps, unfortunately for you, are just too similar genomically to be separated while keeping the organisms that you need in the same group together. Then Ramat shows this list that someone else gathered of differences between humans and chimps, and I would go over it, but a whole lot of it is actually just wrong. For example, it makes the same nasal bone argument, and it also says like chimps don't have a hymen, which is weird to me because they do. In fact, chimps and lemurs are the only other primates other than humans who do have one.
And Remember, going back, Erica thinks that our brains are exactly the same as theirs. She mentioned that.
I didn't say they were the same. If I'd said that, that would mean that we just were chimps. He can't seem to grasp this concept of similarity versus identical. But, I mean, far be it for me to try to investigate the inner machinations of Raw Matt's mind. Now, the great apes have the same general layout and structures within their brains, but it's not identical. Interestingly enough, and difficultly enough for their case, the differences between humans and chimps have been pretty well documented, but there are also many differences between chimps and gorillas, between bonobos and chimps, and between any of them and orangutans. Again, the point isn't to say that humans and chimps are identical. It's to show that humans and chimps are very similar, and they're more similar to one another in the vast majority of ways, including the genome, than either is to any of the other great apes. Again, supporting common ancestry. Then Raw Matt talks about how the muscles of a chimpanzee are more similar to the muscles of a monkey than they are to a human. Yes, one of the many derived characteristics of humans is the fact that we have more slow-twitch muscle fibers for our finer movements. Chimpanzees have their own derived traits where humans carry the primitive condition as well. For instance, they've reduced the size of their thumb for more efficient knuckle walking, and humans have the primitive long thumb that we find in proconsul. This is not hard.
I digress. On 7 minutes and 23 seconds, she says that primates can't throw things overhand like we can. Well, Erica, yes, they can.
Yeah, I didn't say that.
But they can't throw, for jack. They're horrible throwers. They lob things up and over.
I even make the motion, lobbing. What do you think that is, Raw Matt? That's throwing. Humans are the best throwers in the animal kingdom. We've co-opted this ability that humans and the common ancestor of humans and chimps, as well as chimpanzees, have to hold our hands directly over our head thanks to the orientation of our shoulder blade in order to do this nice follow-through motion that, when in conjunction with our slower twitch muscle fibers, allows for higher dexterity and accurate aim.
This girl's a primatologist. This is her specialty, by the way. Didn't even bother to look it up. She just was told the story. Oh, humans raise up our arms because we left the trees and, there's no reason to raise our arm ups. That's what she said. There's no reason for humans to raise your arms up.
Mission Control, we have a belligerent dumbass here that won't cooperate.
It is astounding to me that he can watch the video where I say the opposite and still come to this conclusion. But then again, this is the guy that, in listing the differences between humans and chimps, says they have far better hearing and bone density and have 2 separate bones in the forearm and lower leg, giving them far better mobility than us. He doesn't know the bones in his own body. Stanley talks about hyoid bones for a minute, and he says, the human hyoid bone is different from any other primates. Like, yeah, humans also have differences in the shapes of certain bones that we share with chimpanzees, longer femurs, for example. But I really think this whole thing is just to make up for the fact that earlier this year, Standing was taught that humans aren't the only primate to have a hyoid. He thought only humans had the bone. And he was taught this by Peter. Remember, our 18-year-old friend. Raw Matt briefly tries to defend Jeffrey Tompkins before they go on this massive ERV screed. I don't really do the ERV thing, that's more of Dan's racket, but I'm going to explain it the best I can here. ERVs are excellent support for common ancestry in the following ways. Essentially what they are is ancient viruses that have incorporated some of their genetic material into a host cell. That host cell then, every time it replicated a portion of this ancient virus's genetic material, and then that material becomes incorporated or basically fixated into the species. Now, when you map out all of these ERVs or ERVs, they fit into a nested hierarchy just like the whole genomes or partial genomes do when we run an analysis on them. But it's not just the presence of the ERVs that create this nested hierarchy and corroborate the rest of phylogeny. It's also the locations of the ERVs, so it's the presence, the location of them, the order that they are acquired, and last but not least, and perhaps more importantly, the mutations that they experience. So the ERVs, the ERVs that humans have that are shared with chimpanzees are all in the same part of the genome. They've happened in the same order with respect to other ERVs, and they have experienced the same mutations. This is statistically impossible if common ancestry is not legit. And the fact that ERVs recapitulate phylogeny both in their order, their location, and in their subsequent mutations is not something that I've seen Donnie actually deal with. See what I did there? Donnie deals. Donnie talks about junk DNA for a while and insists that the entire genome is like fully functional. It's not. Knockout mice alone show that that is not the case. Basically with a knockout mouse, you knock out some of the genome, make it inactive, and then see how it impacts the mouse. And it turns out you can knock out massive portions of the genome in mice and they will reproduce and have offspring that are totally okay. This is because much of the genome doesn't really do anything. Now you might be thinking, what's Donnie's response to knockout mice? Well, he proposes that those genes that you can knock out might actually be pivotal if the mouse is exposed to certain new environments. They'll like get activated or something, like it's Voltron. Of course, no study exists to support this notion, but he's just going to reassert it. So this is another Donnie deals fallacy. I say knockout mice show that the genome is not 100% functional. Donnie says, but have you considered that it just is? And then I say, nope, that's not going to work, because again, knockout mice, and then he just reasserts it again.
So see what I mean? Just quickly looking something up, just very, very little bit, just exposes instantly what she's saying to be true. But the audience, they're never going to check on what she has to say. They're just sitting there going, ooh, wow, ah. And even other people that might be like not knowing anything are probably sitting there like, wow, that is really good evidence.
Ramat tries to argue with pharyngeal gill slits by saying when they do accidentally continue to develop in humans, they like don't give you the ability to respire with them. Like, yeah, that's the point. The point is that they develop at all. And then they argue with cetacean evolution in a very painful way. First, they say that the retention of the pelvis is actually a functional thing, so it was designed into the organisms, which no, but you can have that if you'd like. The real issue is the involucrum, which is an inner ear structure that is found in every living cetacean, every living whale and dolphin. And in the past, it's found initially in Indohyus, a little hoofed coastal dwelling mammal, and then Pakicetus, a more aquatically inclined but still terrestrial mammal living on the coasts, followed by Ambulocetus, which is amphibious. It's living both on the land and in the water, still involucrum, and then Dorodon, Basilosaurus, and the regular cetaceans. So it's linking all of these guys, not through space, through time, clearly showing the evolution of these organisms going from a terrestrial modality to that is marine. The irony is they imply it's convergent evolution, which is that thing they said was super dumb earlier. Ramat argues that because we've seen finches speciate in the modern day, that humans can't speciate because we've never seen a human speciate into something new.
Well, what do we see in animals? Within just 2 generations, we've seen Darwin's finches produce new species. So clearly after 1,200 generations, we'd have new species of humans, right? Because isolated tribes are everywhere. We've never seen it, ever, not once.
But by that logic, no long-lived animal can. No animal with a long generation time can speciate because, he references Aboriginal people groups 30,000 years ago, but like African elephants were the same 30,000 years ago as they are today as well. So by his logic, they can't speciate either. But at the same time, Ramat thinks that African elephants are in the same kind as Asian elephants and as mammoths. So you can see how this doesn't really work. But then we finally move on to hominins. So allow me to give you a little bit of background. We're going to be playing with my tablet, which is why I'm over here. There's also fireworks in the background, so you're going to have to cut me a little bit of slack. Australopithecus sediba is one of the hominins that I propose as a perfect transitional because it occupies an intermediate position between the late Australopiths and early genus Homo. Other perfect transitionals that Standing and Ramat just never seem to want to mention would include the likes of Homo habilis, Homo rudolfensis, and Homo tchadensis, as well as the early Homo erectus specimens that are sometimes referred to as Homo georgicus. Now, Australopithecus sediba was discovered around 2010 by Lee Berger and his son in South Africa at a site called Malapa. Initially, 2 individuals were discovered, a young male, MH1, and an older female, MH2. And the reason these finds were so amazing is because they're in partial and even full articulation in some parts of the body. Human evolution makes one primary prediction, and that's that through geologic time from a basal, ape-like ancestor, we should see the emergence of derived traits eventually leading up to anatomically modern Homo sapiens. These should be things like an increase in brain case size, the shrinking of the teeth, bipedality, of course. Now, when we discovered the early Australopithecines, the creationists just kind of called them apes and said that they didn't walk bipedally. even though we have the feet. And they typically call Homo erectus just a human. Yes, even the Dmanisi stuff, which I don't think they realize how problematic that is, but we will get to that someday. Homo habilis, they also tend to just not touch, despite the fact that we have numerous skulls, and skulls are single bones, so it's very difficult to call it a mixture of things. But that's the problem, right? A mixture of things. That's a very convenient thing to do when your perfect ape man finally comes along. And that's what they did with Australopithecus sediba. It is simply too transitional, to the point that Standing for Truth and Raw Matt cribbed from Contested Bones by John Sanford and Christopher Roop in saying that it is simply a mix of Australopith bones and human bones. So Sanford and Roop suppose the following. They think the spine and the jaw are a mix of human and ape material, the pelvis is human, the ribs are ape, the upper limbs are ape, the hands are human, the skull is ape, and they don't really make a claim on the lower limbs. And I put a little asterisk here right next to ape with regard to upper limbs, because this is a work in progress. My version of Contested Bones, which is here in my hands, is very clear that the upper arm is actually an ape. In fact, they have this to say on the material. Recovered remains of the upper limbs assigned to MH1 and MH2 include an assortment of complete and fragmentary bones, clavicles, humeri, ulni, radii, scapulae, etc. In this suite of bones, there is no evidence of a mosaic assemblage of primitive and derived traits. Experts in the field largely agree on this point. Consistent with the funnel-shaped thorax, the upper limb bones attributed to sediba are unmistakably ape-like, revealing an anatomy perfectly suited for tree-dwelling life. The researchers involved in the analysis of the upper limb bones acknowledge this. Then they quote Stephen Churchill, and then they make a claim that it's very similar to an orangutan, which is very interesting. Then they talk about the hand, which they say is hyperhuman. They describe it as hyperhuman and agree that it's very well suited for tool making, which is really, really interesting. In other words, it is largely because of the ape-like upper limb anatomy that sediba is assumed to be inconsistent with tool making. But if sediba is a mixture of bones from two different genera, then it is reasonable that the hand bone belongs to genus Homo and the ape-like upper limb belongs to an Australopith. This very nicely explains why the hand bones are described as hyperhuman and why the upper limb is considered like that of a chimpanzee. It is not because sediba is evolving to be human with a mosaic anatomy, but simply because it is a mixture of human and non-human bones that do not belong together. So, why is this problematic, my dear viewers? Because a few months after the release of Contested Bones, this paper came out, titled Reconstruction of the Burial Position of Two Hominin Skeletons, Australopithecus sediba, from Early Pleistocene Malapa Cave Site, South Africa. And this is a really interesting paper for many reasons. Let's go through it together briefly now. It should be familiar because you guys have seen it before. We've gone over it before. So, what these guys basically make an argument for is the respective burial positions of MH1 and MH2, two distinct individuals. Now, the fact that these are two individuals is something that Sanford and Roop, and thus Raw Matt and Standing for Truth, would disagree with because they think it's a mix of two genera. In the abstract, they outline a bit on what they're actually attempting to do here, and they note that results confirm the fossils in this unit can securely be attributed to two near-complete skeletons of a juvenile male, which lay in the upper laminated portion of facies D, and an adult female, MH2, deposited in the lower part of these facies. So this is really interesting. Let's read a little bit more about it and try to ignore the fireworks in the background. So here's the site. Again, it's in South Africa, and here is the in situ position of these guys, right? There is MH1, and there's the MH2 arm block, and then they note this laminated flowstone here. Now, this is important to note because when they reconstruct the burial position, they're actually going to reconstruct the actual depositional environment itself virtually. They're going to take the blocks that have been found ex situ, or not literally in the rock in separate blocks, maybe over here, and they're going to reconstruct it to see if they can actually fit the blocks together into an original environment, which is really, really interesting. So here's how they map the stratigraphy. So like the facies, here's facies D and the facies above. The MH2 cluster is in the lower part of facies D, and the MH1 cluster, the juvenile, dips slightly into the facies directly above it. Now they talk about the materials and methods and the hominin remains themselves. So here's some cool pictures. Notice that this scapula fits like a jigsaw puzzle to what is immediately next to it. Now, in these different clusters, based off of what they're going to show you here in a moment with the burial position, we can know that these come from two individuals. They, for one, articulate in many cases. So the methods here are pretty simple. Put the blocks back together with the in situ specimens, if they can indeed be fit together, and see if they create a coherent burial position. Then you'll know if these organisms were buried in place or part of a larger bone bed and maybe intermixed with other different types of organisms. So they know here we refitted the 10 ex situ blocks, including 4 containing fossils attributed to MH1 and 6 containing fossils attributed to MH2. For some of the blocks, refitting was straightforward because it was based on a direct connection between in situ and ex situ specimens. In this case, 2 elements fit together perfectly and no sediment was attached to the fracture surfaces. This occurred when the bone was broken during mining activities, during which a part of the bone was detached and the remainder of it was left in the deposit. It allowed us to virtually refit the complete ex situ block back into its original position within the deposit, which implies that the original position of all other remains present in that block could also be securely reconstructed. But they also feel confident about these refits because of the nature of the articulation of the bones themselves. Two levels of articulation were defined. True articulation refers to bones that are still directly associated with one another, direct contact with no sediment in between the bones in their original anatomical position. The second level of articulation, which we call anatomical proximity, refers to bones that are preserved close to one another in the calcified sediment but are not fully articulated anymore. In other words, they're consistent with the bones that are in anatomical position with little displacement but with some sediment infiltrated in between. So this is really, really interesting stuff because what this means is that there is more to these remains than just what is directly articulated. They discuss bone surface modifications and the general degree of preservation, which they describe as really, really good. And then you get down to the percentages of what else might be down there, and here we go. So B is MH2 right here, and over here this is MH1. Right, so on the left is MH2, on the right is MH1. You can see these are, of course, remarkably well preserved. And a little bit further down, we see the states of articulation. Let's put a pin in this for a moment, shall we? Donnie and Ramat invoke their chimeric species by butchering some work done by Ella Bin and Yoel Rock. Yoel Rock is known for his work on Australopithecus africanus, and Yoel Rock seems to think that the jaw of MH2 and MH1 are actually from disparate genera. He thinks one is from Homo and one is from Australopithecus. Similarly, Ella Bin argues the same for the lumbar vertebra. She thinks we are seeing a representation of Australopithecus as well as Homo at this site. Now, they don't touch any of the other bones. They just talk about the jaw and the vertebra.
Okay. You'll find Gutsick-Gibbon arguing for hours against what we have talked about when it comes to chimeric species. Okay. But just know there's a paleoanthropologist out there that disagrees with her because the field is fragmented, it's contested.
I want to read Ella Bin's email here. This is the email that Standing for Truth and Ramat had up, and this is what she said. In sediba, they found at least 6 different individuals. The individuals were found in at least 2 different layers. See the figure below from a dissertation of a researcher by the name Val. They assigned them based on age to MH1 or MH2. Number 1, the lumbar vertebra of MH1, the juvenile, are short and cranial-caudal, similar to genus Homo. Number 2, the vertebra of MH2, the adult, are long cranial-caudal, similar to the Australopithecus genus. It is very simple. They mix 4 individuals, adult and juvenile Australopith, with an adult and juvenile Homo. We know that in South Africa, at this time, there is strong evidence for the existence of both species. This is true. Contemporaneity has not been under any kind of scrutiny for quite some time now. Then she says, my friend who published the sediba vertebra, Scott Williams, has just published new research about the lordosis of sediba. Lordosis is indicative of bipedality. In this publication, he completely ignores the vertebra of MH1. Why does he do that? Because he knows by now that there are 2 different species in sediba. I do not feel like I have to answer Lee Berger. Many paleoanthropologists dislike Lee Berger. And then she notes that no one is talking about the fact that MH1 is composed of material from 2 different layers. And then she says Yoel Rock feels the same way about the mandible, and she thinks that Australopithecus sediba is a fiction. So where do we go from there? Well, first off, I want to note that this paper right here, and I don't know the one that she's talking about because it's not on the email, but at least the one that Donnie and Ramat show, but I want to show that right here, it is acknowledged that the MH1 material dips into the layer above. But we'll get there in a second. This paper makes an excellent case on the basis of the sedimentary criteria that they still do belong to two specific individuals, as well as with the burial position. But let's back up for a minute. So I'm going to use blue for Ella Bin and Yul Rock. So Ella Bin proposes that the MH1 lumbar vertebra, that's this material right here, is Homo-like. And she also argues that the lumbar vertebra over here is Australopith-like. As you can hopefully see from this paper here, Yul Rock argues the opposite with regard to the jaws. He thinks that the jaw of MH2 is Homo, and that the skull and jaw, actually I think he just argues for the jaw, that the jaw of MH1, so just this portion right here, is Australopith. Now this makes quite a bit of sense, right? Because this mandible is obviously in articulation with the skull, and the skull is very clearly Australopith-like. Sanford and Roop, and by association, Standing for Truth and Ramat, propose that the pelvies are human. And they're in articulation, direct articulation with this Australopithecus vertebra. How strange. Isn't that neat? Isn't that so interesting? These pelvies too, they would describe as human.
Put a pin in that too.
So we're back to discussing what is actually articulated, and we can see that the primary articulations occur in MH2, so the adult female, and it is the complete right hand, the manubrium and the clavicle, that's the piece of the sternum and the clavicle, the scapula and the humerus, the elbow joints, 4 thoracic vertebra, the sacrum and the right pelvis, the right ankle, the right knee, the last 2 thoracic and last 2 lumbar vertebra, and the sacrum and the last lumbar vertebra. So there's that problem we just discussed here. But we have an additional problem, because the entire right arm up here in B is effectively articulated. And if we bop back over to Sanford and Roop, we will see that in their opinion, the arm is going to be classified as ape, but the hand is undeniably human. Hyperhuman is what they called it, while the arm is undeniably chimp-like, were their words. So this is obviously a huge issue, right? If we run down the line here with our nice pink, we can see that this whole area being articulated is not great for them. Because much like this area here, it effectively suggests that, well, you got an Australopith and you got a human and they're running at top speed at one another. They collide, they die, and then they preserve just looking like they were once the same organism. But this spurred something interesting, because I guess it must have come to Sanford and Roop's attention that this is a completely untenable position, that the arm situation was untenable. Because in their second edition of the book, they changed their tune.
Upper limbs, okay? This is an argument, Erica, I think this is kind of her main argument now. Like, well, the hand is human, but you're saying the arm is ape, and yet they articulate so well. Okay, let's have a look at this, guys. Sediba, upper limbs. If Sediba is truly the immediate ancestor to upright walking members of our genus Homo, why does it have an upper limb anatomy that indicates it spent most of its life in the trees? This conflicts with De Silva and Berger's claim that Australopithecus sediba was a habitual biped, upright walker. Notice this. Yet these types of contradictory anatomies, with some bones appearing distinctly ape and others appearing distinctly human, are expected of a chimeric skeleton that combines Homo and Australopithecus bones. However, in the case of Sediba's upper limb, it does not appear to be a chimeric, and there are reasons to question the orangutan interpretation of the upper limb and shoulder girdle, and we'll get into that next. Okay, so yeah, where there is significant articulation, okay, and not disarticulation in fragments, then yeah, we can determine this is either an ape or a human. The bottom line is that the evidence used to support an orangutan-like upper limb in Sediba is questionable at best. The overall morphology of the upper limb and shoulder girdle is consistent with those of modern humans. Okay, Erica, so she can stop saying that, well, the hand and the upper limb, they articulate, and yet, Standing for Truth is saying that one belongs to human, one belongs to a non-human ape. It's like, no, if they're articulated, then sure, let's look at it. Let's examine it. Let's look at the relevant papers. Let's look at the literature, and let's decide, what are we dealing with? Both the hand and the upper limb bones of MH2 were found in close anatomical association. Because they were found in close anatomical association, we can differentiate between that which is human, that which is, according to the evolutionists, non-human ape. So if you have a hand and an upper limb that's articulated, and it's all human, then you can't really say, well, they're putting forth this idea that, human and a non-human ape are running at each other and they hit each other at 100 kilometers an hour and their bones explode and bam. That's not how it works, okay?
They admit what they have to and omit what absolutely cannot be the case under their model. But even without that articulation with the pelvis, it's still an issue for Donnie and Ramat to take Ella Bin at her word here. Not because Ella Bin is definitely wrong, although I think she is, and we'll get into that in a minute, but because even if she is correct, the MH2 lumbar material is the lumbar material of an Australopith by her own admission. And her colleague Scott Williams covered the lordosis of that individual, meaning it's a biped. I just realized looking at the top here that this is the paper Ella Bin was referring to, Val et al. So she noted that in this paper, they discuss the nature of MH1, some of the MH1 material being in a different facies. But I wonder what she thought of it, because they also show, this is some superb geologic work, they're able to actually match the sediment within the skull that came as an inflow through the foramen magnum after burial and desiccation with external stratigraphies. Like, I don't know why she thinks that this is such a profound issue, but that being said, they note down here, these observations combined with data presented above on the location of the in situ blocks, direct and loose refitting of ex situ blocks, arrangement of hominin remains, and previously acquired information on their morphology, what's derived and what is derived and what is basal, fully support the attribution of two main clusters of remains to two Australopithecus sediba individuals, MH1 and MH2. Anatomical connections and close proximity of these remains allow us to discuss the processes involved in the deposition and preservation of such a remarkable ensemble. So then they go down and they show how these guys were probably lying when they were preserved, because it turns out when you fit all of the ex situ pieces back together, you can recreate their burial positions. So the burial position paper makes a superb case for two individuals being at this site. But I want to give Yoel Rock and Ella Bin a fair shake, so let's look at some of the responses to their work. So initially we get this one. This is a new paper that came out that, as Standing for Truth has mentioned, has not been covered by Ella Bin and Yoel Rock just yet, on the mandibular ramus morphology. So the ramus is this portion of the mandible here. It's sort of this back portion where the hinge of your jaw, if you will. And what our authors here, Hawks and Berger, note is that the range that we find at Malapa between MH1 and MH2 is not outside of the range for other hominins, meaning just because they're different doesn't mean they're from different genera. And they compare it to the Australopithecus africanus specimens down here from Neanderthals at Cima de los Huesos, and they basically say, look, if your whole basis is on intraspecific variety, it's not going to work here because you can find it in other hominins. Specifically, Hawks and Berger note here, Rock et al. Claim to show that the differences between MH1 and MH2 are beyond what is expected in a trait's normal range of distribution in a given population. The three other samples that we show in Figure 1 disprove this assertion. Each sample has the mandibular ramus variation manifested at Malapa. The morphological features that Rock et al. Describe as derived in Australopithecus actually occur widely across Homo. The form that Rock et al. Used to describe as a characteristic of Homo occurs not only within Australopithecus sediba, but also within Australopithecus africanus. I want to touch on a paper too, noting that the upper limb of Australopithecus sediba is effectively undeniably primitive, which makes its association with that hyperhuman hand, again, highly problematic. So these guys say in their abstract, I actually know Trent Holliday, I met him at the AABAs. The evolution of the human upper limb involved a change in function from its use for both locomotion and prehension to predominantly prehensile and manipulative roles. Well-preserved forelimb remains of a 1.98 million-year-old Australopithecus sediba from Malapa, South Africa, contribute to our understanding of this evolutionary transition, whereas other aspects of their postcranial anatomy evince mosaic combinations of primitive and derived features. The upper limbs of the Malapa hominins are predominantly primitive and suggest the retention of substantial climbing and suspensory ability. The use of the forelimb primarily for prehension and manipulation appears to arise later, likely with the emergence of Homo erectus. And you want to know what the really interesting part about this is, Donnie, is that they make comparisons here to the morphology of other Australopiths. So if your boys, Sanford and Roop, want to make the argument that the upper limb is actually very human-like, then they are tacitly admitting that all Australopiths have extremely human-like upper limb anatomy. So boys, here's the sediba situation. You can invoke Ella Bin's work, but then you're tacitly admitting that all Australopiths are bipeds actually, given the direct articulation that the lumbar vertebra she classifies as clearly Australopith is directly in contact with that bowl-shaped bipedal pelvis. Or alternatively, you could say Gibbon is wrong, and then you just gotta deal with MH1 and MH2 being real specimens. This isn't, of course, an issue for Gibbon and Yule Rock, even though I think they're wrong, because they're cool with Australopiths being bipeds. Again, this is not controversial at all in the paleoanthropological community. Virtually everybody I know of, and the only reason I'm saying virtually is because I'm allowing for the potential crackpot to be brought up, knows that they're bipedal. But it is an issue for you and for these boys.
Well, there actually is a problem. You can puzzle things together like that. And when they go, oh, no, you can't put things together and have them fit so perfectly together. Well, what are you talking about? There was a baboon spinal column in Lucy for 40 years that didn't belong there. Of course you can make mistakes. The mistakes happen all the time.
The baboon or Theropithecus vertebra that was tentatively assigned to Australopithecus afarensis or Lucy was never in articulation or even anatomical proximity with any of the other vertebrae. So that doesn't really apply here, does it, Ramat? But all this huff on Australopithecus sediba, and we forget to talk about Homo habilis or our friend Homo rudolfensis. So I'll be doing a video here eventually discussing the transitional nature and morphologies of these two once I get them painted so you can actually see what's going on these skulls. Because given the sheer number of Homo habilis crania that we have, I would even argue perhaps it makes a better perfect transitional. Donnie tries to blame transitional species on pathology in the fossil record, and we get this.
Present in great apes and Australopithecus and Paranthropus and in early Homo, H. erectus and even to some degree Neanderthalensis, but not in modern Homo sapiens, are generated in humans by growth deficits due to the absence of thyroid hormone. In other words, many of the pathological features of cretinism mimic the primitive characters of evolution, making it easy to mistake pathological features for primitive characters. The differences can be disentangled by understanding the underlying biology of characters. So here's the thing. We're not just saying, well, these certain bones, like let's say Floresiensis or Naledi.
What was that last sentence there, Donnie?
The differences can be disentangled by understanding the underlying biology of characters. So here's the thing.
Paleopathology is an entire field, so it's not surprising that the author of this text would note that yes, we can actually tell the difference as long as we're informed as to what pathology looks like in the fossil record, but boy, he really sped through that sentence, didn't he?
So yes, when we do look at every single example that they can point to, you know what we find? We find that there are either fully human, degenerate human, fully ape, or just not really much in the lines of the various non-human apes.
I hope you realize what a joke this is, right? On that list, he has fully human, fully ape, degenerate human, degenerate ape, and a mix of bones. Those last three categories are just catch-alls for transitionals they don't like. Want to prove me wrong, Donnie? Then actually answer the question and present the criteria for how you determine each of these categories. Stop dodging. Then Ramat goes rapid fire on a bunch of stuff we've already been over. Quick note here, creationists did not predict any of what Ramat is about to say. They didn't predict a single one of them in the literature. They accommodate them after the fact, but they did not predict any of them. And if you'd like to prove me wrong, Donnie and Ramat, show me. With the date, please.
Sure, okay, they predicted slow mutation rates. We found fast, the exact opposite. So what they do, they invented the phylogenetic mutation rate to go with the fossil record. Completely contradictory. What do we use in medicine? We use the pedigree rate, the observable one. Why? Because it's true. What do young earth creationists use? We use the observable one and we make predictions on it. They don't make predictions on it. Wonderful, right?
1, creationism didn't predict that. 2, the rate is actually slow because 3, Nathaniel Jeanson used a mutation rate instead of a substitution rate. Next.
They predicted high genetic diversity. We found low. The exact opposite. They invented the bottleneck to save them.
Species range wildly in their genetic diversity today, and evolution didn't predict that it would be particularly high or particularly low. Now, humans do have low genetic diversity, but guess what? So do bonobos. Next.
They predicted slow speciation. We found fast. The exact opposite. Boom, again.
Speciation is slow, or at least you better hope it is, unless you want every proboscidean and dinosaur being its own kind. Next.
They predicted a slow fossil record of gradualism. Like I said earlier in the show, boom, they found the exact opposite. We found everything that you shouldn't find. Stasis, punctuated equilibrium, rapid radiation events, everything fast, everything in between. Unfalsifiable yet again.
Darwin proposed gradualism and also didn't know about genetics. The guy did a lot of good, but he was wrong too. Science changes. Next.
It predicted inbreeding of a small bottleneck of just 2 would cause inbreeding problems to kill everything. Guess what? Founder effect. Everything works just perfect.
Inbreeding is problematic. Look what happened to Neanderthals. I don't think he understands the founder effect. Next.
Shocker, I know. They predicted a high population of women going back 200,000 years ago. We found a single mtDNA line going back just thousands of years ago. They predicted high male genetic diversity going back even longer. Guess what we found? Single maternal line going right back to a single male just about 4,500 years ago.
Evolution predicted both mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosomal Adam. They're both necessary for population genetics to be legit. This is why coalescence theory exists and has existed since population genetics was invented. They were basically a mathematical certainty understood since the modern synthesis. Next.
They predicted genetic increase over time. We see genetic decay over time, the exact opposite of the predictions.
We document new genes all the time, and when comparing modern genomes to ancient genomes, no entropy has occurred. Next.
It predicted harmful mutation rates would have been around for hundreds of thousands of years. Guess what? SNVs and all harmful mutations rose about 5,000 years ago.
This one doesn't understand how selection works. Next.
Evolution theory assumed beneficial mutations given drive evolution forward. Guess what? There's not even enough time for most of them to occur. All of the timelines that they invented from their fossil record aren't true when it comes to the genetic information and biology that we have. So they invented a fossil record and then said these layers are different ages. And then they go by these radiometric dates, which are very systematic because, they're by weight. So as they go down in time, they go, okay, must have been when this creature evolved because we found it in that layer. Then they test it based on how often beneficial mutations occur.
Waiting time problem is nonsense. See? Next.
It's just next after next. They never predicted taxonomic restricted orphan genes, right? That's what we found.
Taxonomically restricted orphan genes denoting the kinds makes every species a kind and makes Noah's Ark impossible. Next.
They never predicted functional ERVs. They're considered junk DNA, 100% worthless. Well, that was wrong too.
Functional ERVs have been known about since ERVs have been known about, and no, the genome is not fully functional. See knockout mice. Next.
They never predicted groups of organisms having the same features. That's why, like for example, flight found in birds and insects and reptiles and mammals and even fish and insects, right? Oh, what was it? What did it? Oh, convergent evolution must have done it, I guess. I don't know. Ironic that we explain it better than they do.
And remember, their best rescue devices, like here's one, coalescence theory.
Calling coalescent theory a rescuing device when it's been around since the modern synthesis and since before the human genome even began the sequencing process is just ridiculous and shows that Donnie doesn't actually know anything about the history of population genetics. This man is overturning evolution, ladies and gentlemen.
And Erica's going to mention that. She's going to say, even though we've provided numerous irrefutable lines of evidence as to where we can draw the line on ancestry to demonstrate separate and not universal ancestry, but she makes the claim again. Nobody's answered my question on that.
If you had, I wouldn't have been able to use clips from previous videos to answer your statements in this video, Donnie. Donnie wants to talk about the gulo gene, so we're going to go ahead and let him, and then we're going to rip him to pieces. So I mentioned the gulo gene earlier. It is a broken gene that all haplorhine primates have. That means we cannot synthesize our own vitamin C. We have to get it from our diet. Now, this gene is broken in the same location, in the same way in all haplorhine primates. This is important to note because it means it's likely a result of common descent, almost certainly a result of common descent, as the odds of this breaking in the exact same way, in the exact same place in all haplorhine primates is virtually zero. We know this because other mammals have broken gulo genes too, and they're broken in different ways.
One of the key arguments, which Erica used by some proponents of evolutionary dogma, is that the human and chimpanzee gulo pseudogenes are examples of inherited, shared genetic mistakes. However, as demonstrated in this report, overall evidence for common ancestry across the entire human gulo locus with chimps and other great apes is completely negated by the following discovery. So here's a few reasons, guys. Compared to chimpanzee and gorilla, the 28,800 base gulo region in humans is only 84% and 87% identical to chimpanzee and gorilla, respectively. The 13,000 bases upstream of the human gulo region corresponding to the putative area of loss for at least two major exons is only 68% and 73% identical to chimpanzee and gorilla, respectively. Okay, guys, so what we see is taxonomically independent breakages. Independent from, let's say, humans and chimpanzees being related and therefore inheriting the mistake from a common ancestor in the past. Each independently exhibit completely different and discordant phylogenetic patterns of similarity for all but one exon. The transposable element content for each region of putative exon loss is taxonomically restricted and evolutionarily discordant between humans and each ape taxon.
As soon as I saw the numbers that Donnie had pulled up here, I immediately thought this is the work of Jeffrey Tompkins. So I hit the net, and lo and behold, I immediately found several large-scale debunkings of his work by people who just ran the tests themselves. And some of these guys have dunked on Jeffrey Tompkins before. Naturally, it gained absolutely zero traction in the conventional science community. One, because it was published in the Answers Research Journal, and two, because his math sucks again. He's the same guy who says humans and chimps are 85% similar because he weights a 200 base pair sequence as equal to, 1500 base pair sequence. It's absolutely insane. So let's go through this. Ace of Spades has nicely laid this out for us back in 2014. Ace of Spades, I believe, was actually involved in the previous Tompkins debacle. I was astounded to read this paper by Jeffrey Tompkins, paper in quotation marks. At first I was astounded because I couldn't believe Gulo had lost 6 exons independently in humans, chimps, gorillas, and orangutans. After checking up on that data, I was astounded that this author would make so many obvious errors, either intentionally or unintentionally, especially when the data is available to the public for verification. This is important because Ace of Spades goes on to just verify it themselves and tell you how to verify it. Right in the abstract, the author makes the astounding claim that the 28,800 base pair Gulo region is only 84 and 87% identical compared to the chimp and gorilla respectively. So the first thing they did was fetch the 28,800 base pair region, 28,800 base pair region that he was talking about from the UCSC, and then blasted the sequence against 2 other human genomes, a chimp, a bonobo, a gorilla, and an orangutan, using the NCBI blast tool. And what they got, of course, was that they were 97.5% identical to chimpanzees, which is, of course, not surprising. As expected, his numbers were far off from the real figures. The blast search for chimps found the sequence and reported it was 97.5% identical. After downloading the complete region of the chimpanzee chromosome 8 and aligning it for all these positions, it rose up to 98.1% identical. And for gorillas, they were 96.6% identical. So this is kind of interesting. And then, of course, bonobos were very similar to the chimp number, and orangutans were at 94%. So, okay, that's kind of weird. In fact, they go the things that the author got wrong, because then they compared the entire region and found, of course, humans are more similar to the chimps than the gorillas, as we just saw with those numbers. These were the things the author got wrong. Humans and chimps are more similar. Humans and chimps are 97.5. Humans and gorillas are 96.6. I am now going to try and understand how the author got results that were so incredibly misleading, as he claimed he used a previously established technique of optimized sequence slices and the BLAST-N algorithm. Again, for those who weren't paying attention, you don't use online browser tools to do real, publishable science, typically. And the long and short of it is, Ace of Spades can't figure out how he got the number. In fact, he goes on to say something along the lines of, he got 94%, and at this point he must have just goofed and put 84% because it's so unbelievable. But they do finish, I'm going to put this in the description so you can kind of see it for yourself. But they do finish by saying this scientific paper illustrates perfectly why we should stick to real scientific journals that use real peer review systems. Clearly, the closest thing ARJ can have to a peer review system is, does this look good for creationism system? I'm sorry to have to word this so strongly, but this paper is an embarrassment to both the ARJ and the author, and is an indictment of creation science. I'd like to ask the admins of Uncommon Descent to allow me to publish this as an article on the site. Of course, I would understand if they weren't inclined to allow material to be published that challenges creationist perspectives, because this was published on an intelligent design friendly website. So, the long story short is very much like Tompkins' previous work. It's just bullshit. They say a few more things, make a few more jokes, and then that's the end of the video.
We're gonna call it here, Matt. As we say, more things wrong said in one sentence than words in that sentence. So
they did promise me a series, but I didn't actually get that. They got one more video out with Jason Lyle talking about how the speed of light just isn't actually bad for creationism because it's infinite one way. It's really ridiculous. There's absolutely no empirical support for it. It's basically just gesturing and saying, see, look, this could work. No, it couldn't. Where are the numbers? I gave you mine. You give me yours. So that's pretty much it. I am exhausted going through all of that. I really didn't have a very good time. I had a good time editing it, and I had a good time, thinking about how Standing for Truth is going to be a little miffed upon seeing these videos, because this will come as no surprise, but I'm not the only one who released a video today. Ta-da! Dan and Dapper also released their own videos, because the initial purpose of this was to show that, Standing for Truth is not a really great guy and he's not actually worth your time engaging with. But, you know me, I'm thorough and I hate myself. Donnie and Ramat are arrogant, hateful, they are unempathetic, and proud. They will host absolutely anyone, domestic abusers, racists, sexists, it doesn't matter, as long as they feel that they can increase their sub count and their perceived relevance. They're also pretty half-rate creationists, given they crib absolutely everything from someone else. And the stuff that they crib, they usually butcher anyways. Few people I've ever seen in my life are capable of talking for so long about a subject they know so little about. Guaranteed this really rattled the monkey cage, so Donnie and Ramat are probably going to have another 6 to 8 hour midnight stream that nobody's ever going to watch. But, you know, I don't need to be seeing any of that, and neither do you. We've all got better things to do with our lives. I already regret the amount of time I spent on this video, to be honest, even though it was fun to make. So I guess I'll just end it with the title of this video.
It's not worth it! It's just not worth it! Goodbye, everyone. I'll remember you all in therapy.